Hey guys, tonight we're going somewhere dark, not creepy dark, but centuries of oppression erupting in fire and blood dark. We're slipping into the rough, cracked leather boots of a medieval peasant. Someone who works from sunup to sundown just to survive, only to have everything they produce taken by someone who's never lifted a shovel in their life. Tonight, we're talking about why peasant revolts were so violent. And spoiler alert, it's because they kind of had to be. You probably won't survive this. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know where you're watching from and what time it is. I'm guessing it's late. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Imagine this. You're born into a world where your job is decided for you before you even take your first breath. You will be a peasant, not by choice, but because your father was, and his father before him. Your family has farmed the same plot of land for generations, but don't let that word "your" fool you. You don't own anything. Not the house, not the land, not even the chickens pecking around your feet. Technically, it all belongs to the local lord, a man you may have never seen in person, but who demands a chunk of your harvest, a fee for using the communal oven, and another tithe to support the church. Yes, even baking bread has a surcharge. You wake up before dawn, the rooster crows like he's your cursed alarm clock, and you roll off a pile of straw that counts as a bed. Your hands are already blistered before the day begins. Every step through the muddy fields, every swing of the scythe, every aching bend of your back is a reminder. This is the only life you get. No matter how hard you work, you can't escape it. There is no promotion, there is no working your way up. You produce food, you pay taxes in crops and coin, and if there's a war, which there's always a war, you're expected to contribute your body or your sons. That's the deal. Forever. But let's be clear, you're not just poor, you're trapped. Feudalism is like a human terrarium. The nobles and clergy sit up in their castles and churches, pulling strings, writing rules, and bleeding you dry while they drink wine out of goblets big enough to bathe in. You're stuck in the mud, sometimes literally, watching your village crumble from disease, famine, or simple neglect. There are rules to this life, and every one of them is stacked against you. And it's not just physical suffering, it's psychological too. You're told this system is divine, that God wants you to suffer, and you'll be rewarded after death if you just keep your head down and your mouth shut. You see a priest once a week who tells you the poor shall inherit the earth, but conveniently he still lives better than you. You're taught obedience from childhood, scolded if you even imply that life could be better. And the noble class? They see you as something between a child and a beast of burden. Useful, dirty, and easily replaced. Now, picture this going on not for years, but for centuries. Entire family lines grow old and die without ever knowing a single moment of real power or autonomy. You go hungry while watching oxen fattened for noble feasts. You bury siblings lost to plague while the Lord builds another hunting lodge. That kind of inequality doesn't just wear you down. It burns, it simmers, and eventually, under the right conditions, it erupts. So when we ask, why were peasant revolts so violent, we're asking the wrong question. The better question is, how could they be anything else? Violence is often the only tool left when every other voice has been silenced. It's not calculated, it's feral. It's not clean, it's chaotic. And it usually starts with something small, a raised tax, a brutal punishment, a food shortage. And then one day someone throws the first stone, the whole village watches, then another joins, then 10, then 100. And just like that, the pot boils over. Here's a historical moment for you. In medieval France, there were laws that allowed lords to demand that peasants use the lord's mill, the lord's wine press, and even the lord's oven. If you dared to bake your own bread at home, you could be fined, or worse. Can you imagine that? Working all day in the fields and then getting punished for trying to make your own loaf of bread to survive. That's not just oppressive, it's humiliating. And humiliation has a way of fermenting into rage. Now, for a quirky little detail. Some peasants believed that certain noble families were literally monsters, half demons in disguise. There were rural legends about lords with tails, or who drank blood, or who made pacts with the devil. These stories weren't just folklore, they were emotional coping mechanisms. If someone is treating you like livestock, your brain starts to dehumanize them back. Because if they are monsters, it's okay to fight back. And speaking of fights, historians still debate what the actual tipping point is in most of these revolts. Was it always economics? Sometimes it's religion, sometimes it's political shifts. Sometimes it's just a charismatic leader with a good yelling voice. It's still not entirely clear why some villagers revolted, and others stayed quiet even when conditions were equally bad. The fuse was everywhere, but no one knows exactly what lit it or why. But here's the truth. Peasant revolts were never just about food or taxes or even freedom. They were emotional, raw, personal. They were about the unbearable weight of a life you didn't choose, and the brutal, terrifying decision to throw everything into chaos because anything had to be better than this. And once that decision was made, oh boy, there was no going back. The moment someone shouts, "Enough!" everything changes. You're no longer just a farmer or a herder or a cobbler. You're part of something electric, something terrifying, a crowd, a mob. The very air changes, thicker, hotter, full of shouts and boots on dirt and the smell of sweat mixed with adrenaline. Pitchforks get pulled from barns, scythes too. That was supposed to be tomorrow's work, but now they're weapons. Torches. Oh yeah, someone's already lit one. The sky isn't even dark yet, but you know it's going to be a long night. You push toward the centre of the village square, where people are gathering fast, so fast you barely notice your feet are moving with them. It's like gravity's shifted. You don't even remember deciding to join. It just happens. Because it's not just one person rising up, it's everyone, all at once. The tax collector's cottage is the first to go. He's not even home, but his door gets kicked in anyway. Parchment scrolls are torn up like dead leaves. Some poor kid tosses a jug of ale through the window, and the glass shatters like the last bit of patience. Why is it always this sudden, this explosive? Because for peasants like you, there's no safe way to protest. There are no suggestion boxes in the manor. No labour unions, no petitions. Even whispering your anger in a tavern could earn you a visit from the bailiff, or worse. So when a revolt finally begins, it skips the middle steps. It skips talk, it skips strategy, it lunges straight into action, claws first. And that action, it's not quiet, it's not clean, it's not calculated. It's all fury all at once. Now here's the thing you live with every day. You're not just taxed once. You're taxed constantly. There's the taille, a kind of head tax, then the tithe, 10% to the church, then the banalities, fees to use the Lord's tools and facilities. If your neighbour borrows your donkey and it breaks a leg, you still owe a fee. Even when you marry, you pay a fee. Even when you die, your family pays a death duty before your soul can rest. You work to pay these off all year long, and if you fall short, there's punishment. Jail, public flogging, or just losing your land altogether. And let's not forget forced labour. It's not enough to tend your own patch of dirt. Several days each year, you're required to work the Lord's fields for free. It's called the corvée, and it's treated like a favour to your ruler. No complaints allowed. Think about that for a second. You're essentially a part-time slave, and that's considered normal. So when peasants do rise up, they don't hold back. That tax office? Burned. That manor house? Ransacked. That bailiff who beat your cousin last winter? Dragged into the streets screaming? You don't have polished armour or forged steel, but you have numbers, you have fire, and you have rage honed over decades. It's not even about survival anymore. It's about dignity. And after a lifetime of scraping in the dirt, a man with a pitchfork and a grudge can be very, very dangerous. Quirky detail here. Some of these taxes were paid in animals. One record from 14th century England shows a man paying his debt with a live goose, 3 chickens, and a single eel skin. Yes, an eel. Not even the full eel, just the skin. And if you think that sounds ridiculous, imagine trying to carry your tax payment in a squirming, honking sack while your kids cry from hunger at home. That kind of absurdity makes rebellion feel not only necessary, but downright funny, in a bitter, gallows humour kind of a way. And even though this fury feels justified, it's not without risk. Some people try to calm the crowd. They warn that retaliation will be swift, that the nobles have guards, horses and iron, but they're drowned out by chanting, by cheers, and by that thud. The one that means the door's just been broken off its hinges, there's a window smashed, someone's already looting, you can't stop this wave now even if you wanted to. But why not just protest peacefully, you wonder? Well, that's where the scholarly debate kicks in. Some historians argue that peasants tried peaceful resistance first. They petitioned, they pleaded, they offered compromise, but those efforts were ignored or crushed, sometimes violently. Others suggest that the culture of the time simply didn't imagine peace as a possibility. Power was kept or always taken, never given. So revolts were shaped by the world that made them, brutal, unequal, and soaked in fear. In a society where violence is used to rule, it becomes the language of resistance too. And then there's the social shame. You live under the constant threat of humiliation. Public punishments, stocks, whippings, all designed to strip you of dignity. So when the tables turn, you return the favour. It's not enough to kill the bailiff. You strip him, parade him, maybe even make him recite the laws he once used to extort you. It's about more than revenge. It's about flipping the script, even if just for a moment. As twilight falls, the rebellion spreads like spilled oil. Neighbouring villages see the smoke. They send messengers, maybe even join in. The rage spreads not because someone planned it, but because the system is the same everywhere. You may not have maps or messengers, but word travels fast when it's soaked in fire. And even though you know, this won't end well, there's something euphoric about it. About shouting in the face of centuries. About tearing down the things that kept you small. For the first time in your life you feel tall. Not because you've grown, but because the people who look down on you are suddenly, terrifyingly on the ground. This night won't last, you know that. Tomorrow might bring soldiers, or gallows, or worse. But for this one dusk-lit hour with the manor house crackling behind you and the whole village gathered like a storm on legs, you feel something wild and dangerous hope. Let's talk about hunger. Because in this story it's more than just a growl in your belly. It's the fuse, the kindling, and sometimes the match. In a peasant's world, food is never guaranteed. You can do everything right. Plough the field, plant on time, pray for rain, even say a quick word to St. Isidore, the farmer's patron, and still come up short. Maybe it hails, maybe pests come, maybe there's just nothing. And when that happens, starvation sets in not like a sudden strike, but a slow tightening. The bread gets thinner, the stew gets weaker, and then one day you realise you're grinding up tree bark to stretch the flour. Yes, that happened. Now imagine doing all that, scraping together the bare minimum to keep your children alive, only to have the tax collector show up demanding his cut. The same amount he asked for last year, even though your yield is half. Even though your youngest daughter hasn't eaten meat in months, and your neighbour just buried her second baby. Still, he insists, because he doesn't have to worry about food. And the Lord certainly doesn't. He's hosting feasts, chasing boars for fun, tearing through roast venison with the silver teeth. Meanwhile, your ribs poke out like fence slats and your stomach sounds like a dying bellows. This, right here, is when things get dangerous. Not because you're weak, but because you've run out of options. Hunger strips you of fear. You can't be afraid of punishment when you're already watching your family disappear before your eyes. So when a revolt begins, when someone throws that first stone or swings the first pitchfork, it's not just anger driving you, it's desperation. Starving people don't calculate odds, they leap. A vivid example, in 1320, in the years just before the 100 Years' War kicked off, a famine swept across much of Europe. Crops failed across the board, entire towns ran out of grain. In parts of France, people resorted to eating grass, leaves, and even the bark from trees. There are records, chilling ones, of parents abandoning their children in the woods because they simply couldn't feed them. One woman reportedly walked barefoot for 30 miles just to beg for a single loaf of bread. She didn't get it. That same summer, the local noble family imported barrels of salted fish from Italy for their dog wogs. You see where this goes, right? Hunger makes you see things differently. Suddenly that manor house isn't just where the Lord lives. It's a fortress full of stolen food. You start to imagine what's behind those locked doors. Salted pork, sacks of grain, maybe even butter. Real butter. You haven't tasted that in over a year. And once that idea gets in your head, it doesn't leave. Hunger makes fantasies feel like plans. Now here's a quirky, almost absurd truth. In some areas, during a particularly bad famines, peasants would make what they called famine bread. This stuff was wild. It could include acorns, moss, crushed animal bones, and my personal favourite, rotten barley, mixed with ashes. It was so tough that people would joke it could break your teeth, and so foul that it might send you to the latrine faster than you could chew it. And yet they ate it, every last bite. Because the only other option was nothing. So when a revolt does happen, food is usually one of the first targets. Storehouses are raided, noble kitchens are broken into, chickens, pigs, even wine snatched. For one day the poor eat like kings, and not quietly. They sit in the great halls, feet on the tables, ripping apart roast burrs with greasy fingers. They raise goblets they've never touched before and toast each other. It's part protest, part parody, and fully cathartic. You're not just taking food, you're taking back power, one greasy leg of lamb at a time. But here's the scholarly debate. Was it always about food, or was food just the tipping point? Some researchers argue that famine alone isn't enough to start a rebellion. After all, hunger has existed in peasant life forever. What tips things, they say, is injustice on top of hunger. A greedy official, a corrupt priest, a noble's cruelty. Hunger creates pressure, yes, but it's the betrayal that makes it explode. And betrayals were plenty. Lords who raised taxes during famines, priests who locked the church grain stores, monarchs who spent lavishly on war, while entire regions starved. You grow up believing that your suffering has purpose, that it's the order of things, but when you see those at the top flaunting their excess while you bury a child in shallow frozen soil, something snaps. So when you storm the castle, or more likely the manor, it's not just theft, it's justice, or what passes for it in your world. Sometimes that justice gets ritualistic. The food is paraded through the village before it's eaten, almost like a prize. Sometimes nobles are forced to serve the food themselves, turning the social ladder upside down for just one surreal, furious afternoon. Other times the revolt ends right there, with a full belly and a half-drunk village collapsing into sleep around a bonfire. But the damage has been done. The message is clear. We are hungry, and we are done being quiet about it. Not every revolt burns down a manor or slays a lord. Sometimes it's more subtle, silent looting, hidden bread riots, a few animals missing from the noble's pasture, or maybe just sabotage. Grain burned in the fields, mills clogged with stones. These are smaller acts, but they're revolts all the same. A quiet defiance, harder to punish, but just as pointed. But of course, most revolts don't stay small. The moment blood is shed, or even spilled wine on a noble rug, word spreads, soldiers are called, retaliation follows, and suddenly, that bread you stole feels like a death sentence. Because, let's be honest, it might be. Still, in the moment, the act feels worth it. Worth the risk, worth the flames. Because for one night, one glorious wild night, you weren't starving, you weren't begging, you weren't nothing, you were full. And tomorrow? Well, tomorrow can burn. You'd think after a plague wiped out half the population of Europe, the survivors would catch a break. Fewer mouths to feed, more land to go around, and this is the key, fewer workers. Simple supply and demand, right? If labour's scarce, the people who do the labour suddenly have value. That's what you and your fellow peasants are starting to realise in the wake of the Black Death. It's the mid-1300s. Entire villages are ghost towns. The cemeteries are full, but the fields still need ploughing, the cows still need milking, and the lords, well, they still want their banquets, which means they need you, desperately. At first, this shift feels almost like a blessing. For once in your life, you have leverage. Some landowners even offer higher wages just to get you to stay and work their fields. Others reduce your labour obligations or give you more favourable tenancy terms. It's not generosity, it's survival. They need your hands. You finally have something they want. And for a while, there's a flicker of change in the air. A whisper that maybe, just maybe, the world could start tilting a little more in your favour. But no, that whisper gets stamped out fast. Because the people at the top see what's happening and they don't like it. They've spent centuries building a world where they're always in control, a world where your suffering is tradition, not a problem. So when they realise that you've gained power, real economic power, they panic. They pass laws, harsh ones. Laws that say you can't demand higher wages, that you must work for pre-plague rates, that moving to find better work is forbidden. It's like someone handing you a key, watching you step toward the door of freedom, then slamming it in your face and bolting it shut. One example. In England, the Ordinance of Labourers, 1349, and the Statute of Labourers, 251, were royal attempts to freeze wages and tie workers to their villages. Think of it like the worst job contract ever, only it's national law and enforced with shackles. If a peasant left their lord to work somewhere else for better pay, they could be dragged back and punished. You're literally fined for trying to survive. And this is where the violence brews again, because it's not just oppression, it's oppression that teases freedom, that dangles the possibility of a better life in front of you, then punishes you for reaching toward it. That kind of bait and switch breaks something deep in the human spirit. So when revolt comes, it's not just about taxes or hunger anymore, it's about betrayal. You were promised nothing, but for a brief moment you had hope. Now even that's been taken. And when that hope dies, something darker takes its place. The tension turns into action in 1381, when one of the most infamous peasant uprisings in English history erupts, the Peasant Revolt. And at the heart of it is a man named Wat Tyler, just a regular guy, a roof tiler by trade, not a noble or a priest or a politician. But he becomes a figurehead, a spark. The spark is a poll tax, flat, unfair, and aggressively enforced. Doesn't matter if you're a beggar or a merchant, you pay the same. And when tax collectors arrive in Essex and Kent, poking around with threats and armed guards, something snaps. Whole communities rise up. They don't just refuse to pay, they arm themselves with sticks, farm tools, anything they can find, and then they march. Not just locally, but all the way to London. Imagine it. Thousands of peasants marching on the capital, their footsteps beating into the mud like war drums. Along the way, they free prisoners, destroy tax records, burn buildings. It's not just rebellion, it's erasure. They're trying to wipe the system clean. Here's a quirky fact. During this revolt, rebels broke into the Savoy Palace, one of the richest homes in London, belonging to John of Gaunt, a powerful noble. They found barrels of fine wine, and instead of drinking it, they smashed every single one. Why? Because this wasn't about indulgence. It was about fury. They didn't want what the nobles had, they wanted justice. And justice, in their eyes, meant destruction. By the time the rebels reach London, King Richard II, only 14 years old at the time, is forced to face them. He meets the crowd, makes promises, assures them their demands will be met. He says, "We are all equal now." And for a brief, dazzling moment, it seems like something historic might actually change. Then Wat Tyler is murdered, just cut down, during a second meeting with the king, no trial, no warning, and the promise of equality, dead with him. What follows is a brutal crackdown. Rebels are hunted, executed, and scattered. Heads are put on spikes, villages are punished. The king's promises vanish like smoke. Historians still debate whether the revolt ever had a real shot. Some say the movement was too chaotic, too emotional, lacking the organisation needed to bring about systemic change. Others believe the revolt was a turning point, a moment that forced the ruling class to realise that peasants were no longer willing to suffer quietly. Even if the immediate results were grim, the idea had been planted, that the poor could rise, that fear could go both ways. And here's something most people forget. After the revolt, the poll tax is never collected again. It's gone. The king won, sure, but not completely, because he knows now what peasants can do when cornered. The nobles know too. There's a scar on the memory of England now, and it whispers a warning to every lord who thinks he can push too hard. So while the peasants don't win the war, they win something just as important: recognition. The violent noise of their uprising echoes in the halls of power for generations. And even if history tried to write them off as a mob of angry fools, the truth is this: they were people who saw a brief chance at change, reached for it, and bled for trying. And if the system had been fair, just a little fairer, maybe they never would have picked up those pitchforks in the first place. You're sitting in the back pew of a cramped, candlelit village church. The air smells like wax and damp stone, and there's a dull murmur of coughing from the folks around you. You're here every Sunday, not out of choice, but because it's what you've always done, what everyone's always done. The priest stands at the altar in a robe stitched with gold thread, a man who lives better than anyone in your village, but never does a day's physical work. He's talking about obedience, submission, the will of God, and as he drones on, something in your gut twists. Because outside your kids are hungry, your rent is due, and your fields are barely growing anything this year. But then, something different happens. One Sunday, there's a new priest visiting from a nearby town. He's louder, sharper, and his words sting in a good way. He talks about justice, about how the Bible never said kings should hoard while the poor starve. He quotes scripture that you've never heard before, verses about the meek inheriting the earth and the sins of the rich. You're not educated, but even you can tell. This guy is saying the system isn't just broken, it's sinful. And that right there is the beginning of something dangerous. Because if you've been told all your life that your suffering is holy, that your position in life is ordained by heaven itself, then hearing the opposite shakes your world. Suddenly, your pain isn't sacred, it's the result of corruption. Suddenly it's not just your body that's chained, it's your soul. And that realization? That's revolutionary. In the late Middle Ages, religion wasn't a side dish to daily life. It was the main course. The church controlled education, land, law, and even time itself. The calendar was filled with feast days, fasts, and saints' days. The bells rang morning, noon, and night. If the church said jump, you didn't ask how high. You just jumped. Because eternity was on the line. So when that same institution started producing voices of rebellion, priests who sided with the peasants, it turned everything on its head. One of the best-known examples comes out of England again, in the person of John Ball, a radical priest who becomes the spiritual backbone of the 1381 Peasants' Revolt. Ball had a reputation for preaching outside the church's strict authority. He was jailed more than once for saying things like, "When Adam delved and Eve span, who was then the gentleman?" In other words, if God created everyone equal, where did all this hierarchy come from? You hear that from a priest and suddenly your rage has moral weight. You're not just fighting for food anymore, you're fighting for your soul. Not every rebel priest stands at the pulpit though. Some preach from hedgerows or crossroads. Some slip into villages under cover of night, delivering their sermons to crowds of farmers with soot-streaked faces and mud-caked boots. These are illegal gatherings, but people show up anyway, because for the first time someone is telling them they're worth something. Now here's the quirky twist. Some of these preacher rebels believed that the end of the world was near. Seriously. They pointed to famines, plagues, eclipses, all of it, as signs that the Last Judgment was coming. And in their view, revolt wasn't just political, it was apocalyptic. They believed Christ would return soon and reward those who rose up against injustice. So you weren't just storming the manor, you were clearing the path for heaven. Of course, not everyone in the church was on your side, far from it. The official line was always obedience. You were told to be content in your station, to pay your tithes, to confess your envy, and accept that suffering brought you closer to God. Bishops and abbots lived like kings, sat on vast land holdings, and commanded armies of monks who owned more sheep than your entire region had people. When rebellion threatened the status quo, the church responded with fire and sword, blessing noble armies before they crushed revolts and excommunicating anyone who dared challenge the hierarchy. But here's the kicker. Even those who supported you didn't always want full revolution. Some reform-minded priests just wanted the church to act more like Christ, humble, generous, loving. Others had grander visions, a society without nobles, where property was shared, where no one starved or ruled by birthright. These visions never quite agreed with each other, and that tension splintered movements before they even had a chance to grow. Scholars still debate the real role of the church in these uprisings. Was it a source of hope or control, a place of resistance or obedience? The truth is, it was both. Religion gave the peasant rebellions a language to articulate their pain, but it also served as the shield their enemies used to justify slaughter. The Bible could be a sword or a chain, depending on who was holding it. You begin to understand why so many revolts felt like holy wars, why peasants would march under banners with saints on them, or paint crosses on their chests before battle. They weren't just risking their lives, they believed they were saving their eternal souls. And when you believe that deeply, you don't fight carefully. You fight like someone who's already halfway to heaven, which is why these revolts often escalated so quickly. They weren't planned in smoky basements or scribbled out on scrolls. They burst into being with the same force as a sermon, screamed into the cold night. And once they ignited, they pulled everything with them. Faith, rage, fear, hunger, hope. When the rebellion fails, and it usually does, the clergy who supported it face grim fates. John Ball, hanged, drawn and quartered. Others are exiled, imprisoned, silenced. And yet the words they spoke echo long after their voices are gone. Their sermons slip into memory, into folk songs, into whispered stories told around village fires. You sit back in your pew again months later. The preacher is new, tame, careful. His words don't sting anymore. They just pass through you like cold wind. But you remember, and so do your neighbours. You don't say anything aloud, but somewhere in your gut the fire still burns. Because once someone tells you that God is on your side, it's very hard to go back to believing he isn't. You've never held a sword, you've never even touched one, unless you count that time you helped carry a broken one off a battlefield as salvage. Your weapons are tools, things meant for farming, not fighting. A pitchfork with a cracked handle, a scythe you've spent more time sharpening than sleeping. Maybe an axe that usually chops wood, but tonight it'll be something more. And that's the strange thing, when rebellion breaks out, peasants like you don't suddenly get military training. You fight with what you've got, and what you've got is desperation. When you show up to a revolt, no one hands you a uniform. There's no commander in shining armour giving out orders from horseback. What there is, though, is raw emotion, shouted plasts, and a sea of tired, angry people holding everything from butcher knives to shovels. And it works better than you'd think. For a while, anyway. You line up with your neighbours, each of you carrying something sharp, blunt or heavy. Someone's brought a club carved from an old table leg. Another guy, half drunk already, is carrying a length of chain. And someone always has fire. Either a torch, or just a sack of dry straw and flint. Because when you can't cut your enemy down, you burn him out. That's the unspoken motto of peasant warfare. If you can't kill the lord, you can destroy everything he owns. The manor house, the granary, the wine cellar, the family portraits. You don't just want him gone, you want it to be like he was never there at all, like he was a bad dream you're finally waking up from. Take the German Peasants' War of 1524 to 1525. This was no tiny village revolt. It was massive. Hundreds of thousands of peasants, craftsmen and lower-class townsfolk rising up across the Holy Roman Empire. And yes, they were armed, with sticks, flails, hammers, and a particularly terrifying invention. The Morning Star, a wooden club studded with nails. A blacksmith's protest, basically, turned into a medieval nightmare. These rebels burned over 1,000 castles, monasteries, and noble homes. They weren't just rebelling against taxes or labour obligations. They were going after the entire structure of feudalism, and they wanted to smash it into so many splinters that it could never be rebuilt. And they had a cause. They'd written it down. The 12 Articles, a kind of peasant manifesto. It was shocking not just because it existed, but because it was reasonable. Demands like fair rent, the right to hunt and fish, the abolition of serfdom, and the crazy part. Many of the ideas were inspired by the teachings of Martin Luther, the Protestant reformer. Quirky twist. When Luther found out the peasants were using his name to justify rebellion, he panicked. He sided with the princes, called the rebels mad dogs, told the nobles to crush them, and crush them they did. Tens of thousands of peasants slaughtered in retaliation. Entire villages wiped out, bodies left as warnings on the roadsides. It was one of the bloodiest peasant uprisings in European history, and it ended with the same lesson carved into every survivor's memory. Power doesn't just resist change, it erases those who try to demand it. Now back to your own two hands. You know full well your farming tools won't match the weapons of trained knights. They have armour, horses, steel blades that gleam in the sunlight and cut through bone like butter. But you have rage, you have numbers, and you have a terrifying advantage. You're not trying to live through this. Knights fight to win. You fight because you have nothing left to lose. That makes you reckless, unpredictable, dangerous. And it's not just men swinging the tools. Women join the fray too, yelling, throwing stones, wielding kitchen knives or hammers. Kids carry messages, bring water, scavenge for anything that can be turned into fuel. Your entire community becomes a militia overnight. Not trained, not disciplined, but alive, pulsing with the need to finally be heard. Here's something that doesn't get mentioned in most dusty history books. Sometimes your weapons are symbolic, like the boiling water tossed from second-story windows onto passing soldiers, or the piles of manure strategically placed to block a lord's carriage, or the pig dressed in noble clothing and paraded through town as a mockery. That's what makes peasant violence so unnerving. It's personal, it's messy, it's creative. A knight swings a blade and walks away. A peasant makes a point, even if it's with a dead chicken, nailed to a manor door. And historians still argue about just how effective these DIY armies really were. Some say they were hopeless from the start, doomed by lack of coordination and military strategy. Others point out that in certain battles, sheer numbers and brutal tactics gave peasants the upper hand, at least temporarily. Like in the early stages of the German Peasants' War, where the rebels actually managed to seize control of territories, force negotiations, and even defeat some noble forces in open combat. But then, the retaliation came, and it always came hard, which is why, in every revolt, there's that terrifying moment when you realise you've crossed a line, a point of no return. Maybe it's when someone sets fire to the Lord's grain stores, or when a noble is pulled from his horse and beaten to death with a shovel. You look around and realise, this is war now. There's no hiding under your bed and pretending you were sick when the army comes through. You're in it. And when the noble troops do show up, marching in with banners and polished armour, swords gleaming in the sun. You know how this ends. It always ends the same. You'll run, some will die, some will be hanged. But maybe, just maybe, the message will stick. The fire you started won't be so easily extinguished. The manor will be gone, the tax records turn to ash, and the people who watch it all from the sidelines, they'll remember. Because even if your weapon was just a hoe, you swung it like it was justice itself. London smells like sweat, sewage, and wood smoke, and the air tastes like something halfway between adventure and disaster. You're walking down the cobbled streets in a crowd that doesn't feel like a crowd anymore. It feels like a force. It's the summer of 1381, and the Peasants' Revolt has surged all the way into the beating heart of the kingdom. You and thousands of others have made it past the guards, the city gates, and the nervous murmurs of townsfolk watching from their windows. You're standing where kings rule and laws are written, and for the first time in your life, you're the one in control. The English government has been bleeding the countryside dry with taxes, and the final straw was a poll tax, flat, inescapable, and unfair. It wasn't even the first time they'd done it. This was the third round in just 4 years. The poor had nothing left to give, and yet the collectors came anyway. When people refused to pay, things turned ugly. They sent men with clubs and swords to enforce it. Families were beaten, girls were searched, houses were torn apart. That's when you decided enough was enough. And now, here you are, marching on London behind a man named Wat Tyler, a leader who speaks like fire and walks like he's already won. He's not a noble or a general, he's a commoner like you, a craftsman. But when he raises his voice, people listen. And when he says it's time to end the tyranny of the lords, you believe him. The first target is the Savoy Palace, the opulent home of John of Gaunt, uncle to the king and one of the most hated nobles in the realm. It's not just a house, it's a symbol of everything wrong with the world. You storm it with 1,000 others, kicking in doors, tearing down tapestries, smashing wine barrels. There's gold in there, jewels, riches beyond your imagination. But no one steals anything. Instead, you burn it. You burn it all, because you don't want their life. You want them to never have it again. And then it happens. You reach the Tower of London, the actual tower, home to kings, treasure, and absolute power. Somehow you get inside. The gates are opened, whether by fear or sympathy, no one's quite sure, and the crowd surges in. Inside, you find Archbishop Simon Sudbury, one of the architects of the hated tax. He's dragged out, screaming and beheaded on Tower Hill. His head is placed on a pike and paraded through the streets. That image, the severed head of a priest who thought himself untouchable, is burned into your memory. And it feels fair. In that moment, it feels like justice. But here's the thing, this revolt isn't just mindless violence, it's organised. You've got demands, real ones. You want serfdom abolished. You want fixed rents, fair wages, and the freedom to work for whoever you choose. You want corrupt officials gone, and taxes set by agreement, not greed. These aren't the ravings of a mob. They're the beginnings of a social contract, written not on parchment, but in blood and fire. And somehow the king agrees to meet you. King Richard II is just 14. He arrives at Mile End on horseback, nervous but regal, surrounded by guards. When he asks what you want, you watch Wat Tyler step forward and lay it all out. Freedom, justice, an end to the old order. And the boy king listens. He nods, he agrees. He says you are all free men now. The crowd erupts in cheers. Some people cry, others fall to their knees. You can feel history changing right under your feet, but it doesn't last. The very next day there's another meeting, this time in Smithfield. Tyler shows up again, calm and confident. But something's wrong. Tensions are high. The king's men are twitchy. Words are exchanged, sharp ones, then a scuffle. The Lord Mayor of London, panicked or calculating or both, suddenly attacks Tyler. He's run through with a sword and finished off by soldiers. You hear the screams, you see the panic. And just like that, the movement begins to die. The king steps forward, perhaps braver than anyone expected, and shouts, "You shall have no captain but me." For a moment it works. The crowd, stunned and leaderless, begins to disperse. But it's not because they trust him. It's because the dream they clung to, of real, radical change, was just murdered in front of their eyes. What follows is a betrayal so sharp you can taste it. The king rescinds his promises, sends troops to hunt rebels across the countryside. Dozens are executed without trial. Hundreds more vanish. Some try to melt back into their old lives, pretending they never marched, never shouted, never hoped. Others are dragged from their homes and hanged as examples. Yet even in defeat, you know something happened here. The walls shook. The lords trembled. For a brief, radiant week, peasants ruled London. And even if the rebellion failed on paper, the message etched into the city's stone and into the noble's memory is unmistakable. The people can rise, and next time they might not go home so easily. Here's a weird footnote for you. The head of Simon Sudbury, the archbishop, was supposedly preserved after his execution. It was kept at a church in Canterbury, his skull displayed in a niche for centuries. People would visit it, stare into the hollow sockets. It became a kind of morbid reminder of what happens when power ignores the pain of the poor. Historians still argue about how close this revolt came to real success. Some say it was doomed the moment they stepped into London. Others believe that if Tyler hadn't died, if cooler heads had prevailed, the whole feudal system could have been rewritten. Either way, what's clear is that the violence wasn't mindless, it was pointed. It was aimed at symbols, castles, palaces, tax records, arrogant men. It wasn't chaos, it was a reckoning. So you leave the city changed. Maybe you slip back to your village. Maybe you never say a word about what you saw. But every time the taxman knocks, you remember London. You remember the torchlight, the cheers, the smell of burned velvet. And deep down, you know, so does the king. You're trudging through the damp forested edges of the Swabian Alps, boots soaked, hands blistered and stomach rumbling, again. But this isn't another trip to market or a long slog between farmsteads. This time you're with thousands of others, all poor, all angry, and all ready to bring the wrath of heaven and hunger down on the heads of your oppressors. It's 1525, and what began as a few scattered complaints in the German countryside has erupted into a tidal wave of revolt. This is the German Peasants' War, the largest and bloodiest peasant uprising in all of Europe's long, grudge-heavy history. Unlike the sudden, burning fury of England's 1381 uprising, this revolt bubbles up over months. Years even. Tensions build slowly in towns and villages throughout the Holy Roman Empire. It starts with whispered complaints about taxes, tithes, and greedy nobles. Then come the meetings, secret half-legal gatherings in barns and forest clearings. Eventually there's organisation, articulated demands, printed pamphlets. You've got a cause, a structure, and something dangerously close to a movement. For peasants, this is practically a revolution with branding. It all coalesces around the 12 Articles, a kind of revolutionary wish list written by peasants and their more educated allies. The language is humble, polite even. If it should be found that one or more of the articles is not in accordance with the word of God, it reads, such article shall be null and void. They're asking for things like fair rent, an end to serfdom, and the right to choose their own pastors. You know, wild, unthinkable demands like not being treated like property. This is where things get spicy, because just a few years earlier, a monk named Martin Luther had nailed his famous 95 Theses to a church door in Wittenberg, challenging the corruption of the Catholic Church. You and your fellow peasants hear these teachings and feel a little lightning bolt inside. The church is corrupt, salvation doesn't require obedience to bishops, God is on the side of the faithful, not the powerful. That sounds an awful lot like what you've been saying, just with better Latin. And so many peasants believe Luther is with them. They quote his writings, they cite his challenges to authority. They brand their rebellion not just as a social uprising, but a spiritual one. This isn't just about landlords, it's about the kingdom of God on earth. You're not a rebel, you're a Reholmer. A foot soldier in the army of divine justice. With that in mind, a rusty scythe suddenly feels a lot like a holy weapon. But then Luther, safe and dry behind his desk, hears about the uprising and immediately panics. He publishes a vicious pamphlet called Against the Murderous, Thieving Hordes of Peasants. Not exactly subtle. In it he calls for the princes, yes, the same people the peasants are rising against, to smite, slay and stab the rebels without mercy. It's a full-blown betrayal. You might have copied his words onto your banner. Now he's calling for your blood. Still, the rebellion continues, and for a while it seems to be working. Peasant armies, more like armed mobs really, begin taking towns and castles. They loot monasteries. They redistribute food. They even set up local councils to make decisions. It's chaotic, sure, but it's a real challenge to the feudal order. You watch a count's castle go up in flames and feel something strange in your chest. Not just satisfaction, but possibility. Quirky detail here. Many rebels carried banners with images of the Bundschuh, a peasant's tied leather shoe. It became the unofficial symbol of the uprising, a middle finger to the silks and spurs of nobility. You're not just rebelling, you're declaring who you are, poor, shoeless and furious. But your army isn't really an army. There's no training, no discipline. Leadership changes by the day, and you've got more enthusiasm than strategy. Meanwhile, the nobles are organising. They gather soldiers, hire mercenaries, and bring in knights who've fought real wars. They don't care about your articles or your prayers. They want you dead, or at least quiet enough to disappear again into the dirt. The retaliation comes fast. Cities fall one by one, rebel camps are crushed, and the executions relentless. In some places, defeated peasants are hung from trees in rows, left there as warning signs. Others are beheaded, mutilated, or burned alive. The total death toll climbs to somewhere between 100,000 and 300,000. That's not just a failed rebellion, it's a massacre. Historians still argue over what went wrong. Some say the movement collapsed because it lacked unity. Others point fingers at betrayal from within, from Luther, from local leaders who switched sides when things got dangerous, and there are those who say the real mistake was believing that the powerful would ever listen to polite demands, no matter how righteous they sounded. But here's the thing, despite the blood, the losses, the utter devastation, you don't regret rising up. Not really. Because for one fleeting moment the peasants of Europe looked their lords in the eye and said, "We see you, we're not afraid anymore." And that vision, that dream, doesn't die with a sword in the gut. It lingers. It lingers in the burned fields and empty towns, in the whispers passed down through families, in the poems and pamphlets buried beneath floorboards, even in the church, which quietly starts to reform in response to the pressure, and in the legal codes that decades later begin to shift just a little in favour of commoners. You limp away from the ruins of your village, your weapon long discarded, your hands black with soot. You've lost friends, land, maybe even hope. But you've also seen something impossible, a world where peasants dared to write their own future. It didn't work this time, but it happened, and now everyone knows it can happen again. Pay taxes and feed soldiers whether they're friend or foe. You're stuck in the middle, as usual. Armies pass through, trampling your crops and requisitioning your livestock, meaning they just take it. Bandits swarm in behind them, and the lords who swore oaths to protect you? Nowhere to be found. They've holed up in fortified castles, throwing lavish feasts while villages like yours are picked clean by war, hunger and disease. At this point, being a peasant in northern France feels like standing at the bottom of a well while everyone above argues about how best to drown you. And then comes the moment, always that moment, when everything snaps. A small skirmish turns bloody. A noble insults someone's dead son. A village burns for no reason at all. Maybe you hear the news from your cousin in Clermont. Peasants in the region have started rising up. At first it seems impossible. Surely no one would be mad enough to attack the nobility outright. But then word spreads that a manor house was stormed, the lord's family killed, and the whole place burned to the ground. And instead of stopping there, the rebels kept moving, village to village, house to house, a fast-moving storm of rage with pitchforks. You join without really planning to. It's not like there's a sign-up sheet. Someone passes through your village, talks about vengeance and justice and taking back what's yours, and suddenly you're on the road, gripping a hoe like it's a sword. You're not trained. You're not even properly dressed. But you're part of something now. 1,000 Jacquelines and Jacques, all with one message. If the nobles won't protect the people, then the people will come for the nobles. And come for them, you do. Unlike other revolts, the Jacquerie is pure fury. There's no central manifesto, no long list of demands. It's more eruption than movement. The anger is direct, violent, and deeply personal. It doesn't matter whether a lord was particularly cruel or merely complicit in the system. To the rebels, they're all guilty. You break into manor houses and drag out the men. You torch their homes. You don't just kill the nobles, you make a point of it. Brutality for brutality. Men are hacked apart in the streets. Women and children too. The rage doesn't spare them. For peasants, who have watched their own families die nameless and unavenged for generations, mercy feels like a luxury their oppressors never earned. Historians still debate the exact number of deaths, but contemporary accounts are chilling. In one instance, a noblewoman's entire household, family, servants, even the animals, was slaughtered. And this wasn't an outlier, it became a pattern. These weren't random murders, they were messages. This is what happens, you're saying, when the people you trample finally rise. But, and you already know where this is going, it doesn't last. The nobles, once stunned, quickly recover. They band together, rally what's left of their fighting force, and strike back with vicious speed. Their knights ride out, armoured and mounted, against peasants who barely have shoes. One noble army ambushes a group of Jacquerie rebels outside the town of Meaux. It's a slaughter. Hundreds are killed. Any survivors are hanged or mutilated. Captured rebels are tied to carts and paraded through town before their executions, public spectacles to restore fear. One name stands out in the records: Guillaume Calle, sometimes called William Calle, a peasant leader who somehow managed to hold together a part of the movement with enough charisma and clarity to briefly threaten actual change. But like so many before him, Calle is betrayed, invited to negotiations, promised safe passage, and then arrested, executed without ceremony. Another rebel turned cautionary tale. And here's your quirky detail. Some nobles took to wearing extra armour on their horses, not for protection, but to look heavier, more terrifying, like living statues of death. That's how afraid they were of the peasant rage they'd unleashed. The image stuck. In the months that followed, some lords had their portraits painted with a hand resting on a scorched helm, a subtle nod to their role in putting down the Jacquerie, as if they wanted to be remembered not for courage, but for their brutality. To this day, historians debate what the Jacquerie really meant. Was it a serious attempt to restructure society, a moment of pure vengeance, or just a spark in the long fuse of revolution? The lack of structure, the rapid escalation, and the sheer violence of the revolt make it hard to analyse with clean theories. But one thing is certain. For a few furious weeks in 1358, peasants did the unthinkable. They reminded the nobility that their power wasn't divine or eternal. It could be challenged, it could burn, and what's worse, for the lords at least, is that the rebellion's violence wasn't random. It was understandable. Peasants didn't wake up one day bloodthirsty. They lived their whole lives being treated like livestock, taxed into starvation, worked to death, and then blamed for their own poverty. The Jacquerie wasn't a glitch in the system. It was the system cracking apart at the seams. After it's over, you return to your village, or what's left of it. Your name isn't recorded in any chronicle. You won't be mentioned in history books. But your hands are cracked and blackened, your memories soaked in smoke, and your eyes have seen nobles beg. For a peasant, that's not nothing. And though the rebellion failed, the fear it left behind lingers. Noble families start building stronger walls, hiring more guards, and occasionally listening just a little harder when the harvest fails. Because now they know there's no such thing as a harmless Jacques. Not anymore. You wake up to the sound of hammers striking stone and voices shouting over the clang. Florence is always loud, always restless, always halfway between a prayer and a riot. The year is 1378, and the air stinks of sweat, tannins, and ambition. This isn't some muddy countryside village. This is a Renaissance city in bloom, with marble churches rising into the sky, and trade guilds battling for prestige like petty princes. But don't let the art and fountains fool you. For workers like you, Florence is just another gilded cage. And right now, the ones rattling that cage are the Ciompi, wool workers, dyers, spinners, and fullers, people at the very bottom of the economic food chain in one of the richest cities on earth. You're one of them. Maybe you drag soaking wool up steep alleys, reeking of dye and sweat. Maybe you spend 10 hours a day teasing out snarled threads with your fingernails, coughing from the fibres clogging your throat. Either way, your job feeds the wealth of this republic, but you're not allowed to vote in its politics, not protected by a guild, and certainly not respected. You're cheap labour in a finely stitched Florentine cloak, and the thread is about to snap. What sets this revolt apart from the others is the setting. This isn't farmland, this isn't a village revolt against some sneering baron. It's urban, industrial, organised by the standards of the day, and yet still deeply, viscerally angry. The textile industry is the backbone of Florence's economy, and the wool industry especially, lana as it's called, is massive. But within that proud, polished industry, the Ciompi are the bottom rung. They do the dirtiest work, take the lowest wages, and have no legal voice. They're not even recognised by the guild system. They're ghosts with calloused hands. And that silence? It's been festering for years. The spark comes not from hunger this time, but from politics and promises. Tensions between elite families and mid-level guilds create a kind of chaotic opening. There's a power vacuum, a chance to shake things up, and the Ciompi, they see it. They move fast. In July of 1378 they rise. Not with torches and pitchforks this time, but with tools, fists and shouted demands. You pour into the streets with hundreds of others, swelling into the Piazza della Signoria, the beating heart of Florentine power. You shout for representation, for guild status, for fair wages, for the right to exist as more than invisible labourers. And unbelievably, you win, for a minute. The revolt takes the city by surprise. The Wool Guild leaders try to stall, then panic. The ruling Signoria gives in briefly, hoping to calm the wave. They recognise a new guild. The Guild of the Woolcarders. Your guild. For the first time you have legal standing. You cheer, you cry, you celebrate in the streets. Statues are garlanded. Someone brings wine. It's euphoric, disorienting, like waking up from a nightmare to find the sun shining on your face. You even elect your own man to office. Michel de Lando, a former Woolcomber-turned-spokesman, becomes the Gonfaloniere of Justice, the highest civic office in the Republic, a Ciompo in power. You blink at the news, stunned. Is this a joke? Is this Florence finally seeing the people who built her? But power's a strange thing. It's heavy, slippery, and quick to burn the hands that grasp it. Michel de Lando turns out to be complicated. He tries to play both sides, reformer to the workers, respectable to the elites. He hesitates, he compromises, and before long cracks appear. The Ciompi begin to split between moderates who want to hold the gains and radicals who demand more. Land redistribution, debt cancellation, and punishment for exploiters. Sound familiar? It's the same trajectory every peasant revolt follows: momentum, division, and betrayal. By August, the city elite begins to push back. They stir rumours of anarchy, whisper about chaos and heresy. And, this is key, they remind the middle classes that radical change threatens them too. It's an old trick: divide the poor, frighten the comfortable. It works every time. Tensions explode on August 31st. Armed guards loyal to the guilds clash with radical Ciompi in the streets. It's not a full-scale battle, but the message is clear. The dream is over. By September, the Ciompi Guild is dissolved. De Lando steps down. New laws are passed to prevent any such movement from rising again. And the workers? Silenced, shoved back into the factories, their calloused hands still needed, but their voices muted once more. Here's your quirky footnote. After the revolt was crushed, the Florentine government made it illegal for any worker not enrolled in one of the official 21 guilds to participate in civic life. And naturally the new laws made sure no one like the Ciompi would ever get close to the halls of power again. It was a legal muzzle, tailored for the poor, stitched with fear. Historians love to debate whether the Ciompi ever had a real chance. Was it a flash of utopian idealism, or just a wild moment in a city caught between the medieval and the modern? Some argue that the Ciompi didn't think big enough. They got the right to form a guild but didn't demand real economic overhaul. Others say the movement was simply too radical for its time, too unsettling for a republic built on merchant wealth and careful hierarchy. But for those brief weeks in the summer of 1378, Florence bent. The streets echoed with the voices of men who usually couldn't even afford to speak in public. Their bare feet scuffed the floors of palaces. Their ideas made the city tremble. And even after it ended, the memory lingered like dye on fingers. Stubborn, hard to wash away. You go back to work, you card wool with raw knuckles and aching shoulders, but you remember. You remember standing in that square chanting with your brothers. You remember Michel de Lando's speech. You remember believing, for just a sliver of a season, that you mattered. And maybe that belief is dangerous. Or maybe it's necessary. Because now you've seen what happens when the lowest class in a jewel of a city stands up and demands to be counted, not as workers, but as citizens. You hear them before you see them. Hooves on sound stone, the rhythmic clink of armour, the low deliberate thump of the marching boots. Then the banners appear, fluttering over rooftops like thunderclouds with gold trim. The noble militia has arrived, and no matter how far you run or how well you hide, this was always going to happen. Because when peasants revolt, when you really revolt, there's only one way the ruling class ever responds. With force. Swift, merciless and public. But make no mistake, they're not just coming to stop you, they're coming because they're afraid. Terrified, actually. The great secret behind every violent peasant uprising is that the nobility fears the poor. Not mildly, not in theory. Deep down in the pit of their silk-lined guts, they are terrified that the people they exploit will one day turn around and bite. And when the bite comes, it's not a nibble. It's jaws, teeth, fire. You're not supposed to be scary, you're supposed to stay in your lane. Silent, obedient, hunched over in a field or sweating over a forge. You're supposed to shuffle past with your eyes down, bow at the right times and die quietly when the grain runs out. But revolts break that illusion. They flip the social script. Suddenly, you are the one giving orders, dragging noblemen into the mud, shouting, demanding, burning. And nothing frightens a noble more than watching the people they've spent their lives standing on suddenly stand up. It's why they always retaliate with overwhelming violence. Not just to put you down, but to send a message to future rebels, to other peasants still weighing their options. They don't just want to win, they want to terrify. Rebellion, in their eyes, is a disease, and they treat it the way medieval doctors treat plague, with fire, knives, and a total lack of empathy. Take the aftermath of the English Peasants' Revolt. After the murder of Wat Tyler, Richard II promised peace, promised mercy, and then, within days, revoked every single concession. He personally oversaw the executions of rebel leaders and even approved public displays of their severed heads on pikes. That wasn't law enforcement, it was theatre, a spectacle designed to remind the poor that even if they breach the gates of London, they'll never really win. And let's not forget the brutal response to the German Peasants' War. After months of uprisings, the nobles didn't just crush the rebellion, they annihilated it. Entire villages razed, fields salted, women and children killed alongside the men. Between 100,000 and 300,000 peasants dead, many left where they fell as a warning to others. Not a single noble was executed, not one. And that, right there, tells you everything you need to know about how society values lives when it's time to punish the disobedient. There's a quirky, almost ridiculous twist in some places. After rebellions, nobles would literally rebuild the same manors that were burned down, exactly as they were, just to show they could. A peasant revolt destroys a castle? No problem, they'll build a bigger one, with thicker walls, and a gallows installed right out front this time, thank you very much. It wasn't about necessity, it was about control. A performance scripted in stone and funded by blood. And yet the fear never really goes away for them. That's why they overreact. That's why they build stronger fortresses, pass harsher laws and fund inquisitions to sniff out discontent before it sparks. Because deep down they know the truth. There are more of you than there are of them. Always have been, always will be. And when 1,000 peasants with pitchforks move with purpose, even the tallest tower starts to feel like a coffin. Historians still debate how much of this fear was rational. Were the nobles truly in danger of losing everything? Or were they just so addicted to power that the idea of resistance felt like existential collapse? Some scholars argue that many revolt could have been calmed with small peaceful reforms, reduced taxes, land grants, basic rights, but instead the elite chose force every time, not because it was effective long term, but because it made them feel safe, temporarily at least. And don't think fear only came after a revolt started. No, often, revolts were prevented by displays of force so intense they bordered on madness. Like when a lord would randomly execute a few peasants pour encourage les autres, to encourage the others, or when entire villages were fined into oblivion because one person muttered something rebellious in a tavern. These weren't justice systems, they were preemptive strikes. Fear management, 14th century style. But you know what's strange? Sometimes it backfired. Sometimes the violence was so over the top, so cartoonishly cruel, that it inspired more uprisings. Word would travel, quietly, through gossip songs or travelling peddlers, about what happened in such and such village. About the woman who spat at the tax collector and got flogged. About the farmer who lost everything, snapped and killed a steward with a shovel. These stories weren't cautionary tales, they were legends, and they spread like wildfire. Not always quickly, but steadily, always. You feel that power in your bones, even after you return to your hovel. Your rebellion crushed, your friends dead or missing. You hear about a nobleman who won't ride alone anymore, a steward who doubled the guards on his grain wagons, a bishop who cancelled a sermon in the town square because of a security concern. And you realise They are still scared. That fear may be wrapped in armour and legal decrees, but it's real. And it's yours. You put it there. You and every rebel who ever lifted a hammer and said no more. So even if you lose, and you usually do, you leave a mark. On the cities, on the laws, on the psyches of the elite. Your revolt becomes part of a long, terrifying memory that rattles the keys in their belts and the gold in their pockets. They'll never say it out loud, but they know. They sleep in silk sheets only because you allow them to. And that's why when they come riding into your village in shining armour with death in their eyes, they don't just want to punish you. They want to erase the idea that you were ever brave enough to rise. They drag him out at dawn, still half asleep, one boot missing. He's coughing, maybe from last night's smoke, maybe from the blood in his mouth. His hands are tied with rough rope, and he stumbles on the icy stone steps of the manor house, that's now just a blackened husk. The crowd watches in silence as the noble is forced to kneel where he used to give orders. And then someone steps forward holding a rope, a fine rope, silk-bound, pulled right from the Lord's personal chambers. That's the point. Peasant justice is rarely subtle. It's deliberate, performative, and when it needs to be, unspeakably brutal. You'd expect peasants to simply kill. Quick, messy, and done, but you'd be wrong. In Revolt, justice isn't just about punishment, it's about symbolism. It's about turning the world upside down, even for just a moment. So when you finally catch the man who's bled your village dry for years, you don't just hang him, you hang him with his own robe, from the same rafters where he stored your stolen grain. Or maybe you pull his dining table outside now and use it as a stage, strip him of his silk and put him in rags, then read aloud the crimes he committed before the noose tightens. It's not law, it's theatre, a dark, furious performance for an audience that's been forced to watch suffering their whole lives. Now the roles are reversed. This wasn't just one event. Across rebellions you find this same pattern. Peasants delivering a kind of poetic justice. They burn tax records in the village square, chanting over the smoke like it's a ritual. They force nobles to carry their own furniture out of the manor before setting it ablaze. They boil stew in the manor's copper pots, serving it to the same villagers who've starved for months. Even the act of eating becomes rebellion. There's a recorded incident in Flanders where a tax collector was beaten, stripped and paraded through town in a wagon filled with mud, wearing nothing but a wreath of pig intestines. His crime? Raising grain levies during a famine. His punishment? Becoming the joke of the very people he once controlled. That kind of humiliation doesn't just sting, it lingers. It haunts. Because to you and others like you, dignity has always been a privilege. You're whipped in public, taxed in public, ridiculed in public. So when the uprising begins, it's not enough to win. You have to shame the oppressor. Strip him down in every sense until he feels even a sliver of what you've carried your entire life. And it's not just lords. Priests too. When they've betrayed the poor, hoarding food, selling forgiveness, backing noble brutality, face the same wrath. There's a moment in the German Peasants' War where an abbot is cornered and dragged from his monastery. He pleads for mercy, claims he never harmed anyone, but the villagers don't care. They make him walk barefoot through town, handing out bread and wine until he collapses. Then they torch the monastery, not for the loot, but for the message. Your holiness means nothing if it feeds only your own belly. Still, these acts, however satisfying, have consequences. Symbolic justice makes for incredible stories but dangerous optics. When the nobility sees how far the rebels will go, it gives them all the excuse they need to respond with civilized savagery. They'll call it law. They'll call it restoring order. But really, they're just answering spectacle with spectacle. Here's where it gets weirder. Some peasant movements staged mock trials. Actual scripted proceedings where accused nobles were brought before makeshift judges, often their former tenants, and tried for crimes against the people. Witnesses would testify, sentences were read aloud. Then came the punishment. Hanging, beheading, or, in one particularly disturbing case, forced exile followed by public stoning when the exile tried to sneak back into town. Were these real courts? Not exactly, but they followed a certain moral logic. If the regular justice system never saw the poor, then the poor would create their own system. And let's be honest, it wasn't always clean. Some revolts veered into outright cruelty. Entire households wiped out. Kids orphaned. People punished not for their actions, but for their bloodline. Not justice, just fury given free rein. Historians wrestle with this. Some argue that peasant brutality during revolts undermined their cause. that it made them look no better than the tyrants they opposed. Others say, understandably, that after centuries of dehumanization, you can't expect the oppressed to rise up gently, that expecting decorum from starving farmers is like expecting a punch to politely knock. And then there's the truth in between. Some rebels were just cruel, others wanted revenge, plain and simple, but most were trying to reclaim something more fragile than land or wealth: dignity. That thing nobles never had to think about, and peasants were never allowed to have. Reclaiming it meant flipping the social script, even if only for 1 hour, one village, one dying scream. There's a story, probably exaggerated but still worth telling, about a noble in Burgundy who during a revolt was forced to serve at a peasant feast. He poured wine, scrubbed dishes, fetched firewood. At first the villagers mocked him, then they grew quiet. One woman wept as he knelt to refill her bowl, and afterward no one killed him. He was sent away barefoot, carrying his own torn coat. Some say he became a monk. Others say he went back to his castle and never punished a soul again. Who knows? Quirky? Sure, but also haunting, because it hints at something deeper, that maybe, just maybe, beneath all the fury and fire, peasants didn't just want revenge. They wanted recognition, to be seen, to be treated as human. And in a world where dignity had to be stolen back through fire, humiliation became the loudest voice they had. So when the rope swings from the charred beam and the noble's silken robe tightens around his neck, you don't cheer. Not really. You just watch. Because you know deep down that this wasn't just about killing a man. It was about killing the idea that his life was worth more than yours. You hear the rumour before you hear the truth. That's how it always starts. A whisper in the tavern, someone muttering by the well, an old woman swearing she saw soldiers marching in the distance. The taxes going up. The miller's son was taken. The lord's horse was found dead, and they're blaming us. You try not to react. You nod slowly, keep your eyes on your hands, pretend not to care. But the tension is already slithering under your skin. Because you've lived through this before, what starts as a whisper becomes a scream. And when people start to scream, people start to die. Revolts don't break out because of cold logic, they break out because of panic. Because fear spreads faster than fire. 1 minute you're at the market buying turnips, the next someone's yelling that the soldiers are coming to arrest anyone who hasn't paid the new tithe. You look around, no one moves. Then someone throws a stone, and suddenly you're in it. It's a strange feeling, the switch from normal life to mob chaos. Your mind doesn't process it all at once. One part of you is still thinking about the chickens you left untied in the yard. The other part is gripping a pitchfork and moving towards the Lord's storehouse with 40 other people whose names you only half remember. This isn't planning. This isn't strategy. This is collective reaction. A pressure valve finally blowing. Mob psychology isn't something you think about in the moment, but it's exactly what drives you forward. One voice becomes 10, 10 become a crowd, and then the crowd becomes a force, something larger than any individual, something with teeth and rage and its own kind of twisted gravity. You're not just you anymore, you're part of it, and it doesn't stop. One of the strangest things about a revolt is how quickly people change. The shy neighbour who barely speaks, he's the one bashing in the grain cellar door. The quiet woman who cries during sermons, she's hurling stones at the steward's windows like she's been waiting her whole life. And you find yourself shouting things you didn't even know you believed. It's terrifying, and weirdly freeing. But let's not pretend it's all righteous fury. Mobs don't come with a moral compass. Sometimes they burn the wrong house. Sometimes they chase down the wrong man. All it takes is a rumour, a name shouted in the heat of the moment, and someone's fate is sealed. He betrayed us. She fed the soldiers. Maybe it's true. Maybe it's not. In that moment, no one cares. The idea of justice becomes loose, slippery. You're no longer asking who deserves punishment. You're asking who's available. And rumours? They feed this chaos like fuel on a fire. One lie can turn a frightened crowd into a death machine. The Lord poisoned the well. The bishop's men are already riding to massacre us. The tax records say your name's next. Some of these are wild, obviously false. Others have just enough truth to make them stick. You don't have a printing press. You don't have news from the capital. All you have is what the neighbour's cousin swears he overheard in town. That becomes your headline. One real-life example: in the lead-up to the English Peasants' Revolt of 1381, entire towns were paralysed by the rumour that the king's soldiers were going to take children as tax hostages. No one could confirm it, but once the rumour started, parents began hiding their sons. And when the tax collectors showed up, innocently or not, some never left alive. Fear turned to action. Action turned to blood. And here's your quirky detail. In one French village during the Jacquerie, rebels held a mock coronation for a scarecrow dressed as a noble. They paraded it through town, threw rotten food at it, then set it on fire. Why? Because someone had heard a rumour that the king had laughed about starving peasants. Maybe he had, maybe he hadn't. But the image was powerful enough that they needed a symbolic royal to destroy. It wasn't about accuracy, it was about catharsis. Historians still debate how much damage was caused by rumour alone during these revolts. Some scholars argue that many uprisings could have been avoided, or at least contained, if better communication existed. If truth had travelled faster than gossip. Others say the rumours were symptoms, not causes. The rage was already there, bubbling under centuries of pressure. The stories just gave it direction. A villain, a face, but what's chilling is how quickly you can become the villain. Say the wrong thing, fail to show up when others do, or worse, ask questions when everyone's chanting. Suddenly you're not a neighbour. You're a coward or a traitor. You feel the crowd shift against you just slightly, like a storm changing direction. And that's when you realise mobs don't forgive. And they don't forget. You start to see the world differently in those moments. You begin to understand how panic isn't just fear, it's transformation. It reshapes people. It takes decent, desperate folks and turns them into executioners, arsonists, looters, but not evil ones, just scared ones. And fear, when shared, becomes something almost holy, something people kill for. And when it ends, and it always ends, you're left with silence, and smoke, and a hole in your gut where the adrenaline used to be. You try to piece together what happened, who did what, who died, who fled, but it's all blur, faces screaming, hands grabbing, doors kicked in. Somewhere in there, someone you knew was dragged from their house. You think you remember cheering, or maybe you stayed quiet. You're not sure anymore. Later, when the soldiers come to clean up, when they ask who led the revolt, who started the fire, who shouted first, no one remembers, or maybe everyone does and pretends not to, because in the heat of it all, it was all of you and none of you, a living, breathing beast made of hunger and fear and fury. Mob psychology is rarely logical, but it's always human. And the most dangerous part? It feels right while it's happening. It starts with a song, a slow mocking chant, rising from the back of the crowd like the smoke curling upward from a lit torch. Down with the lords, up with the land, or something cruder, rhymed, rhythmic and almost cheerful. And just like that, the rebellion becomes a performance. Not just a riot, but a kind of grim pageant. Banners are raised, slogans are repeated, effigies are paraded through muddy streets while peasants laugh and jeer. And suddenly you're not just angry, you're part of a show. That's what a lot of people miss about these uprisings. They weren't just blood and fire, they were theatre. Rebellion for peasants wasn't just about killing the lord, it was about flipping the script in every possible way. The tools of satire, mockery and spectacle weren't just fun, they were strategic. You couldn't always beat your enemies with swords, but you could humiliate them in public, on purpose and with an audience. So you create your own rituals. You stage fake trials in the town square. You drag out a stuffed figure dressed in noble silks and hang it from a tree chanting names and accusations. Someone might wear the bishop's hat they stole and march in circles, preaching about how much gold God needs to forgive your sins. It's absurd, it's dark, and it's effective. Because when power has been used to dehumanize you for your whole life, mockery becomes power of its own. You've seen it before, the way peasants laugh when they dance around a stolen sword, or when they put noble armour on a pig and pretend it's the baron come to collect taxes. These things seem silly, even petty, but they matter. They take fear, your fear, and turn it into something loud, ridiculous, defiant. You're not cowering anymore. You're laughing. And that terrifies them more than rage ever could. In one German village during the Peasants' War, rebels stormed the manor, looted the chapel and then held a fake mass. The priest's robes were worn by a pig. The altar was turned into a dinner table. They passed around a stolen goblet filled with turnip stew and pretended it was holy wine. And the villagers? They roared with laughter. But underneath the laughter was a knife. A message. Your power isn't sacred, it's stupid, and we're not afraid of it anymore. In another case, in France, a rebel leader delivered a mock sermon from the top of a manure pile, wearing the tax collector's hat while shouting blessings for the noble order of the starving bellies. People cheered. Some wept. Others threw handfuls of dirt like it was incense. No one could tell if it was a joke or a revolution, and that was the point. Scholars have long debated what to make of this kind of pageantry. Some dismiss it as simple catharsis, poor people blowing off steam. Others argue it was political theatre at its sharpest. When your enemy wears robes and jewels and speaks in sermons and laws, you don't beat him by imitating him. You mock him. You rip the costume off, show the seams and turn his image into a punchline. That's how you deconstruct power. And let's not forget, most peasants couldn't read. They couldn't write pamphlets or organise secret newspapers. So instead, they used their bodies, their voices, their presence. They made noise. They turned protest into processions, burnings into ceremonies, violence into ritual. This wasn't chaos. It was choreography. Even executions took on a theatrical flair. When nobles or tax officials were caught and punished, the sentence was often preceded by a reading of charges, a litany of crimes shouted in rhyme, rhythm or song. Sometimes it was funny, sometimes it was horrifying, but always it made the victim symbolic. No longer just a man, but a representation of the system. You didn't just hang a baron, you hanged injustice, greed, betrayal. That's what the crowd saw. That's what you told yourself as you watched. There's a story, probably exaggerated, but too good not to share, of a peasant woman in Bohemia who danced barefoot on the table of a noble family she helped drive out. She danced for hours, they say, while others played music on looted instruments and waved banners made from the nobles' bed linens. That night, the manor burned. But what everyone remembered wasn't the fire, it was the dance. And here's your quirky twist. Some revolts had musicians, not just as background noise, but as part of the actual uprising. Drummers who set the pace for a march, fiddlers who played during looting, singers who led chants and songs, some of which lived on for generations, protest ballads, rebellion lullabies, folk tales with a beat. These weren't just battle cries, they were memory. Oral histories stitched into melody. What does that say about rebellion? That even when drenched in blood and grief, it still found room for rhythm, for performance, for meaning. The peasants didn't just want change, they wanted a story to tell about the change. One where they weren't just victims or villains, but protagonists. People who rose up, who wore stolen robes and danced in firelight and said, "Look at us, we exist." Historians are still unpacking this. Was the theatre of revolt just a coping mechanism? Or was it a kind of social magic casting spells through satire to invert a broken world? No one agrees, but what's certain is this. Rebellion wasn't just a blade, it was a show. And the poor were both the performers and the audience. Finally, for once, on stage. You remember that chant, the one you sang when you marched with the others? You still hum it sometimes, quietly, while you work, while you feed the fire. Because even after the stage is torn down and the banners burn, the echo remains. And maybe one day someone will pick up the tune again. She stands in the doorway, arms crossed, lips pressed into a line so sharp it could slice through bone. Behind her, a fire crackles. Before her, the street is filling with shouts and footsteps. You expect her to close the door, you expect her to pull the children inside, but she doesn't. She steps out into the cold night with a rolling pin in one hand and a jug of oil in the other. Tonight she's not baking bread, she's building barricades. You've been told revolts are a man's game, ploughs turned to pitchforks, suns rising in defiance, bearded labourers stomping into manor houses. But in every rebellion you've witnessed or heard about in whispers, women have been there, elbow deep in the chaos, yelling louder than anyone, throwing stones, sharpening blades, handing out food, and, on more than a few occasions, leading the charge. The assumption that women sat quietly by while their husbands rebelled? A fiction written by the same hands that ignored their hunger. Think of the cities, the markets, the wells. These are the spaces women inhabit, the arteries of daily life. When the price of bread spikes, women notice first. When tax collectors arrive, it's often women who answer the door. When sons are conscripted or husbands vanish into dungeons, it's mothers and wives who are left to pick up the pieces, and in some cases, to fight back. Take the 1590s bread riots in France. The spark? Grain shortages and speculation, of course. But it was women who filled the town squares, overturned carts, and screamed down officials. Their chants were about food, yes, but they carried a sharp edge. If our children starve, you'll eat smoke. Not exactly poetry, but it got the point across. In the English Peasants' Revolt of 1381, women didn't just march, they organised. One woman, Johanna Ferreur, was later identified by chroniclers as one of the key figures in the storming of London. She didn't merely accompany the rebels, she led the mob that captured and executed the king's treasurer. That's not a support role, that's front and centre. Of course, they tried to erase her afterward. The usual method: dismiss her as hysterical, dangerous, an aberration. Because women in revolt are always made out to be either harpies or ghosts, never leaders. But you know better. You remember her voice carrying through the smoke louder than the bells. You remember her saying, "If we're going to die anyway, let's at least die fighting." In Germany's Peasants' War, women fought, looted, and in many villages, held down the fort while the men went to the front lines. When the nobles retaliated, they didn't bother making exceptions. Hundreds of women were executed alongside the men. If you think that discouraged female involvement, it didn't. It only hardened it. You can take a mother's food, you can take her land, but take her children and she'll come for you with whatever she can grab, even if it's just a pot of boiling lard. Here's a quirky one. During an uprising in Florence, a group of wool workers' wives stormed the office of a merchant who'd been cutting wages. They didn't kill him. They stripped him, tied him to a wheelbarrow, rolled him through the streets while singing work songs. The crowd laughed until it cried. When the city cracked down, those women were arrested not for assault, but for public indecency. Because apparently the worst crime isn't violence, it's making a powerful man look ridiculous. And there's power in that, isn't there? In mockery, in visibility, in refusing to be invisible when the world demands it. You, as a woman in revolt, are terrifying not because of your weapon, but because your presence alone violates the rules. You're not supposed to shout, not supposed to strike, certainly not supposed to win. So when you do all three, the system doesn't just crack, it panics. Historians still debate just how central women were to these movements. Some claim their participation was spontaneous, emotional, more about survival than politics. Others argue that women often served as the emotional heart of rebellion, the ones who made the stakes real. After all, when the harvest fails, who buries the child? When the Lord raises rents, who watches the house rot from the inside out? Political theory is fine, but lived experience, that's a call to arms. And don't assume all women stood with the rebels, some aligned with the ruling class, especially wealthier merchants' wives or abbesses, who held land in their own right. There were women on both sides, just as there were men. But those who rebelled did so with full knowledge of the risks. They were beaten, imprisoned, mutilated, and mocked in official records. But they acted anyway, because sometimes survival is rebellion, and sometimes there's just no one else left to fight. You think of the woman from your own village, the midwife with scars on her arms and a mouth like a sailor, the one who took in orphaned kids and sold onions at market. You remember the day she stood between the steward's men and your neighbour's door. She didn't win, they knocked her down, but she got back up, again and again. And when they finally left, the village followed her into the fields and began digging trenches, as if it was the most natural thing in the world. And maybe it is, because women in rebellion aren't just supporters, they're sparks. They light fires with their words, their silence, their laughter. They carry water and rage in equal measure. They know exactly what's at stake and they act accordingly, not out of impulse, but out of purpose. So the next time you see a line of rebels forming in the road, don't be surprised if there's a woman in front, sleeves rolled up, eyes like stone, shouting a song you've never heard before. It won't be in the history books, but it'll be real, and it might just change everything. You're sitting beside a fire made from broken fence posts and whatever dry brush you could scavenge from the woods. The warmth is thin, but it's better than nothing. Around you other figures huddle, some from your village, others from miles away, strangers made familiar by shared misery. No one says much. The air is filled with the low crackle of flame, the shuffle of feet, the occasional cough. And yet something binds you all tighter than words ever could. You've all just fought. You've all bled. You've all chosen to rebel. And now you sit here, not as a collection of poor souls, but as something new, a community of resistance. It's a strange transformation. Just days ago you might have crossed the street to avoid some of these people. The village drunk. That sullen man who never looked anyone in the eye. The woman who sold bruised turnips at market and scowled at children. But now you've stood side by side with them behind a barricade. You've watched them throw stones, swing tools, and howl in defiance. And in doing so, they've become different. Not better. Not even necessarily likeable, but yours. There's something about spilling blood together, yours or theirs, that forges a bond no feast or sermon ever could. That's one of the overlooked truths of Peasant Revolt. Violence doesn't just tear things down, it builds. It builds trust, identity, a shared narrative. Suddenly, you're no longer just a serf from a nameless hamlet. You're part of a rising, a cause, a movement etched in smoke and grit. You have fellow rebels, and that term means more to you now than cousin or neighbour ever did. There's historical precedent for this. Plenty, actually. In the 16th century uprisings that swept through the Low Countries, whole networks of rebels formed overnight. Groups that had nothing in common before, cattle herders, fishermen, wandering labourers, found themselves linked by common grievances and common enemies. They shared food, tools, shelter, songs, some even gave themselves names, brotherhoods, bands, companies, not military units but social ones, formed not by command but by experience. In the English Peasants' Revolt, the rebels who reached London referred to each other as comrades or brothers, even when they barely knew one another. The shared act of marching, of risking everything, replaced years of division. And that shift? It mattered, because the lords and tacksmen had always relied on one thing to keep the poor in line: isolation. Divide and conquer, they say. Keep the villagers suspicious of each other, and they'll never unite. Well, that tactic stops working the moment someone throws the first stone. Here's a quirky fact. In several regions of Germany during the Peasants' War, rebels created makeshift field churches after burning down the local chapels that had aligned with their oppressors. They gathered in clearings, passed around shared bread, not consecrated, just plain bread, and declared it a new communion. Not a sacrament, but a solidarity ritual. No gold cups, no Latin, just hands, mouths, and crumbs. It wasn't religious in the traditional sense, it was tribal, a declaration that they didn't need the old structures anymore. They had each other. And once you've felt that, truly felt it, you don't forget. Even if the revolt fails, even if the hangings come, you go to the scaffold knowing someone will remember your name. Not a noble, not a chronicler, but a fellow rebel who watched you hold the line when things got ugly. Maybe they'll sing about it. Maybe not, but they'll know, and that's worth something. It's why even in the face of overwhelming violence, rebels often stand their ground. Not because they think they'll win, not because they're suicidal, but because they don't want to let down the person next to them. You're not just fighting for your rights anymore. You're fighting for the man who gave you his last chunk of bread, for the woman who stitched your torn tunic with shaking hands, for the child who passed messages between camps under cover of night. It's loyalty born in the furnace. Historians like to draw clean lines. Before the revolt, peasants were atomized, isolated, afraid. Afterward, they were briefly powerful, then crushed. But that misses the grey space in the middle. That strange electric moment when ordinary people found each other in the smoke and realised, maybe for the first time, that they belonged together. Even the nobles noticed. There are letters, panicked ones, from bishops and dukes to each other, warning not just of rebellion, but of organisation. The peasants, they said, were forming bonds, acting as if they had the right to meet, referring to each other with honorifics. That last one is oddly specific, but telling. When the poorest among you starts calling another peasant sir out of respect, you know something has shifted. Of course, it doesn't always last. Bonds forged in fire can cool quickly when the fight is over. Once the adrenaline fades and the crops need replanting, people drift. They return to old habits, old rivalries, but not completely. There's always something left, a nod across a crowded market, a whispered remember when, a sense that even in defeat you're not alone. And that's powerful, more powerful than a single revolt. Because it means the next time someone comes to collect the king's impossible tax, they won't just be knocking on one door, they'll be knocking on a network, a web of memory and loyalty and quiet, smouldering defiance. You glance across the fire at the drunk who once tried to steal your chicken. He's asleep now, boots propped on a stone. You used to hate him, but last night he took a cudgel for you. You smile, and suddenly he's not the village idiot anymore. He's your comrade. You notice him, yes, he won't stop glancing over his shoulder. His eyes dart, his jaw clenches. And when the crowd starts chanting again, something simple, loud and angry, he mouths the words but doesn't speak them. You've seen this man before, not at the front of the charge, not passing out bread or boiling pitch, but always nearby, lingering just behind the line of real commitment. And now, 2 days after the manor burned and the steward's body washed up in the river, he's nowhere to be found. Someone says he's gone to another village. Someone else swears they saw him near the magistrate's house at dawn. And deep in your gut, you know exactly what he's done. Every rebellion has one. A traitor, a snitch, a Judas in patched wool instead of silver. And while there's plenty of blood spilled in peasant revolts, nothing runs colder than the betrayal from within. At first, it's denial. Maybe he didn't mean to. Maybe he was tricked. Maybe he was threatened. But then the soldiers show up. Too fast, too precise, heading straight for the hidden caches of weapons, the leader's hut, the safest barn. They know too much. They come too ready. That's when you know the truth. Someone talked. And suddenly it's not just a military defeat, it's a fracture. The rebellion isn't just about fighting lords and taxes and famine anymore. Now it's about trust, or what's left of it. You start looking at every fellow rebel like they might be next. Who knew where the meeting was? Who saw the parchment? Who disappeared for a day and came back with fresh boots? You thought the enemy wore armour and spoke in Latin. Turns out he might wear a muddy tunic and share your campfire. This isn't new. Every revolt from England to Hungary has seen it. Loyalty poisoned from within. In 1381, during the English Peasants' Revolt, it wasn't just the king who betrayed the rebels. Some of the rebellion's own messengers switched sides. Promises were made, leniency, land, even coin. Names were given, arrests followed like wolves on a blood trail. Some rebels didn't even know they were marked, until the hangman's rope was around their neck. Why do people do it? Historians offer theories: desperation, coercion, cowardice, greed, maybe all of the above. If a man has a sick child at home and a sheriff offers him grain in exchange for a name, does he betray the cause, or save his family? What about the woman who saw her brother butchered during the last failed uprising and now wants nothing more than to survive? Is it betrayal or self-preservation? But let's not get too poetic. Some people are just rats, you know the type. The one who always stayed close to the centre of things, but never too close. The one who was loud about justice until the first sword was drawn and then fell silent. He's not tortured by moral ambiguity. He just wants to come out of this richer, or at least alive. If he gets to settle an old score by naming you, even better. And once the snitch is revealed, if they're caught at all, it gets ugly. Peasant justice doesn't handle betrayal with much grace. You've seen what happens, a beating usually. Maybe a slow walk to the nearest tree, some want a proper trial, some want a quick rope, and others just want to spit on the body after. It's not about restoring order, it's about venting the wound. Here's your quirky detail. During a 15th century Bohemian uprising, a traitor was discovered just hours after delivering rebel names to the city council. Instead of executing him in the usual way, the rebels shaved half his head, branded his forehead, and paraded him through the streets on a donkey, facing backward, a sign reading, "I betrayed my bread." He was then exiled, not killed, but marked. A walking warning. That's the real terror of betrayal. It doesn't just ruin plans, it infects everything. Afterward, meetings get smaller, voices get quieter, the laughter stops, even victories feel hollow. If your neighbour might sell you out for a few silver coins, how can you keep the fire of rebellion alive? Some scholars argue that internal betrayal is what doomed most revolts, more than swords or soldiers ever could. The noble class, for all its cruelty, understood one thing very well. Poor people could be manipulated, turned against each other, bought cheap. Divide and rule wasn't just a phrase, it was a strategy. And it worked. But others say that focusing on traitors misses the point. Betrayal only works in a system where people are already desperate. You don't get spies unless there's something to spy for, a reward, a threat, an escape. If the system weren't so brutally unequal, the poor wouldn't need to turn on each other. In that sense, every traitor is just another symptom of the disease, not the cause. Still, when you sit by that fire again, you feel the difference. The warmth doesn't feel as comforting, the silence feels heavier. Every shadow could be a listening ear, every smile could be a lie. You try to hold on to the memory of the bond, of shared risk, of unity, but now it's tangled in suspicion. And that's the real damage. Not the names given or the leaders captured, but the slow decay of trust. Because revolution depends on more than weapons and fury. It depends on believing that the person beside you won't shove a knife in your back. Once that belief dies, everything else starts to die with it. So you guard your words, you meet eyes less often, you move a little farther from the fire. And when someone asks who led the raid last night, you say you don't know, even though you do. The church bell rings out across the hills, low and solemn, calling you to mass. It's not optional, it never is. Even with smoke still curling from the edges of your village, even with men hiding in the woods and women scrubbing blood out of linen, you're expected to show up, hats off, heads bowed, ready to pray. You walk slowly, limping a little, ribs still sore from the last round of punishment. You don't know what the priest will say this morning. Maybe something about peace, maybe something about obedience. But odds are, he won't say a word about the rebellion, because that's the church's favourite trick, to pretend revolts aren't happening until they're too loud to ignore. The church is everywhere. It's in your calendar, your taxes, your marriages, your meals. It's where you go to bury your dead and where your children are baptised. It's the largest landowner comuna in the country, and sometimes the only place with enough food left to eat. It's also, depending on the priest in the parish, your ally, or your worst nightmare. In theory, the church is supposed to care for the poor, feed the hungry, shelter the oppressed. You've heard those sermons. You've read, or more likely had someone read to you, the parts of scripture that speak of justice and humility. And sometimes that's exactly what happens. There are priests who look out for their flocks, who hide rebels in their cellars, who share bread from the altar when famine hits. You've seen it. You've been saved by it. But you've also seen the other side. The bishop who owns 3 manors, the friar who drinks like a king and condemns rebels while lounging on a stolen cushion, the abbey that locks its grain stores during a harsh winter, because the monks have their own mouths to feed. You've watched church officials show up after the Lord's soldiers, blessing the blades, reciting prayers over corpses, telling widows to forgive and pay their tithe anyway. The ones who declare rebellion a sin and submission a virtue, even when that submission means starvation. The church's role in peasant revolts is one of the great contradictions of medieval life. It's both a shield and a sword, a sanctuary and a snitch. And you never quite know which version you're going to get until the doors are closed and the sermon begins. One infamous example. During the German Peasants' War, rebels begged the clergy to mediate. They quoted scripture, argued that their demands were in line with Christian teachings. Some priests agreed. They even marched with the rebels, carrying crosses instead of swords. But the higher-ups, the bishops and abbots, they called for extermination. Luther himself, the so-called voice of reform, condemned the revolt in savage terms. "Let everyone who can smite, slay and stab," he wrote. That's not exactly the Sermon on the Mount, and yet people still prayed, still clutched their rosaries before battle, still made the sign of the cross as they raised their weapons, because for all its corruption and contradictions, the church was still the only spiritual game in town. You could hate the institution and still believe in the message. You could despise the bishop and still light a candle to the Virgin Mary. That tension didn't make you a hypocrite. It made you a peasant in revolt, angry, hungry, and still hoping heaven might be listening. There's a quirky little episode from a 14th century uprising in southern Italy, where rebels stormed a monastery and forced the monks to serve them dinner, on silver platters, of course. When one of the monks tried to preach at them during the meal, the rebel leader stood, raised a goblet of stolen sacramental wine, and said, "Tonight, Father, we will dine like bishops and sin like kings." Then they made the monks bless the meal. Holy mockery in its purest form. But for every monastery that was raided, there was another that stood firm for the people. A priest who rang the bell not to call for worship, but to warn of approaching soldiers. A nun who hid rebels in the herb cellar. A scribe who copied the 12 articles of the German peasants by candlelight, risking excommunication just to give the cause a voice. Historians continue to argue about this dual role. Was the church inherently oppressive, propping up feudal power with divine justification? Or was it a fractured institution, pulled between its wealth and its message? The answer, like most truths, is inconvenient, both. Some within the church saw themselves as shepherds, others saw themselves as landlords, and the peasants? They were either sheep to protect or tenants to fleece, depending on who was holding the crozier. And the sermons, they changed with the wind. Before the revolt, You might hear a homily about submission, patience, the holy virtue of suffering. Afterward, with your village still smoking, the priest might pivot to forgiveness, peace, divine judgment, always reminding you that violence is wrong, unless it's from above. That's the rub. The church rarely condemns noble violence. A castle siege is a just war. A peasant uprising is an affront to God. Nobles kill to maintain order. Peasants kill to survive. Only one gets blessed. The other gets excommunicated. But that doesn't mean you stop believing. No, faith runs deeper than the building it's preached in. You still cross yourself. Still pray before you sleep. But the prayer has changed. It's no longer deliver us from evil. It's Lord, deliver us from them. From the bishop with the armoured escort. From the abbot who eats veal while your baby wastes away. From the holy men who speak of sin but never see starvation as one. The church was supposed to be your refuge. Sometimes it is. Other times it's the first door that slams shut in your face. You hear them long before you see them. The dull, rhythmic thud of hooves on packed dirt. The creak of saddles. The faint clink of chainmail swaying with each step. It's a sound that settles into your chest like a weight. Because when knights ride toward your village, they were not coming to talk. They're coming to remind you exactly where you stand on the ladder and to make sure you never try climbing it again. You peek out from behind a crumbling stone wall, heart pounding, watching as they appear through the morning mist. A small but terrifying procession of armoured men. Helmets polished, surcoats clean, spears upright. Their horses are bigger than your ox, better fed than most of your neighbours. You'd almost think they were gods if you didn't know the truth, that inside that glittering armour are the same smirking, arrogant men who've been bleeding your family dry for generations. It's easy to think rebellion has no chance against this, and by every rule of warfare it doesn't. You're holding a scythe with a bent handle and a pitchfork that's lost a tine. Your shoes are more patched than leather. Your side doesn't have training, tactics or forged steel. You have barely enough food to keep standing, let alone fight. And yet, somehow, sometimes you do win. Because when the numbers are right, and the terrain favours you, and your anger is boiling just hot enough to override fear, peasant militias can do the unthinkable, hold their ground. Not always, not often, but enough to be remembered. Take the Battle of Leitzersdorf in 1486, where Austrian peasants, enraged by increasing levies and noble cruelty, dug in and defeated a company of armoured horsemen. Their weapons, makeshift pikes, sharpened farming tools and homemade barricades built from carts and logs. They fought in tight formations, using terrain to their advantage. Mud and hills became allies. Horses slipped, knights fell, and when they did, they were dragged down and dispatched not with swords, but with hammers, axes and raw, sweaty fury. What makes peasant armies so dangerous isn't their gear, it's their mindset. Knights fight for glory, for lords, for pay. You fight because you have no choice, because your daughter hasn't eaten in days, because your father was flogged for missing a tithe, because you're tired of bowing to men who've never lifted anything heavier than a wine goblet. And while knights may be terrifying, they're also predictable. They charge, they intimidate, but they don't expect resistance, certainly not from people they consider beneath them. So when a volley of rocks hits them from behind a hedge, or when their horses trip over tripwires strung with fishing line, or when a mob erupts from a hay barn wielding torches and nails, that rattles them. They're not used to fighting people who have nothing to lose. You've heard stories of towns that repelled entire companies using tactics that would make a general scoff. Boiling water dumped from rooftops, sharpened sticks buried in dirt, tree branches pulled loose by ropes at just the right moment. Guerrilla tactics, long before anyone called them that. It wasn't noble, and it wasn't fair. But war rarely is. Especially when you've got burlap for armour, and your backup is a guy who makes shoes. There's a quirky bit of history from a 15th century revolt in Switzerland. A group of peasants allegedly trained their pigs to squeal and stampede at the sound of a trumpet. When the enemy troops arrived, the pigs were loosed, terrified, noisy, and utterly uncontrollable. The noble horses panicked, the formation broke, and the peasants attacked in the chaos, winning the day. It's almost too strange to believe, but whether true or not, it speaks to the kind of creativity born out of desperation. Of course, not every skirmish ends in victory. Most don't. More often, you're forced to watch your village burn from the tree line, crouching in the brush as knights cut down your friends like weeds. The term massacre gets thrown around a lot, but it fits. There's no mercy, no prisoners, Just bodies and the sound of boots splashing in blood-soaked mud. That's the price of rebellion. You stand up, you bleed. But the moments that do succeed, those are the ones that echo, because they shake the myth. The myth that knights are invincible, that order is unbreakable, that peasants can only kneel or die. Even if your rebellion is crushed a week later, the fear you left behind lingers. Lords ride with extra guards now. Castles hire more lookouts. The knight's armour gets thicker, and that means they're afraid. Historians love to point out that peasant armies lacked discipline, that they fractured, bickered, sometimes looted their own allies. And sure, it's true, these weren't drilled soldiers. They were blacksmiths, brewers, herdsmen. But they were also smart, determined, and terrifying when united. If you've ever seen a mother chasing a soldier with a kitchen knife, you'll understand. Rage has momentum. And that's the part no knight can prepare for. You don't break ranks because a horn sounds. You break ranks because your best friend just took a spear to the gut. Because you're sick of hearing your cries ignored. Because even if you die, at least you'll die standing up. So yes, the knights look impressive. They shine. They thunder. They tower. But sometimes 100 peasants with nothing left to lose are louder than all the horses in the kingdom. And when you hear that hoofbeat next time, you'll already be lighting the oil. The sky is red. Not from sunset. Not from any natural grace. It's the colour of fire, and the fire is yours. The manor house is burning, its windows spitting smoke, its rafters collapsing in slow, aching groans. You watch the flames reach up into the darkening sky like hands, like an offering. Somewhere behind you, someone cheers, another spits on the ground. No one speaks much. You're too tired, too stunned, too alive. You weren't sure you'd go through with it. Even as you ran through the woods toward the estate, even as you gripped the torch and muttered the same chant the others were yelling, even as you crashed through the front gates with your heart trying to crawl out of your throat, some small part of you didn't believe this was happening. But now it's done. The walls are falling, the tapestries are ash. The master's portrait, stained with wine and knife slashes, has curled and blackened in the heat, and there's no turning back. There's a moment in every revolt where it stops being politics and becomes apocalypse. The world doesn't end with angels and trumpets. It ends like this. Muddy boots, burning stone, and the feeling that everything you thought permanent can in fact be wiped away in an evening. You see it in your neighbour's face, the woman who always complained but never raised her voice. Her eyes are wild now, glassy with something between joy and fear. She tosses an old ledger into the fire like she's exorcising a demon. And maybe she is. That book kept her in debt for half her life. Now it's just ash. You see it in the butcher's son, who you barely recognised when he shoved past you with a mallet. He used to flinch when the taxman rode through. Tonight, he was one of the first to breach the pantry doors. He didn't take food. He just smashed every plate he could find, one after the other, laughing until he wept. This kind of rebellion doesn't feel like a protest. It feels like the end of the world. And for many peasants, that's exactly what it is. The old world is ending. The one where you bow to a man because of the land he was born into. The one where hunger is your inheritance and obedience your religion. That world's foundations are crumbling and the fire is licking at their edges. It's no accident that so many peasant revolts are drenched in religious language. Even if the clergy tries to shut it down, you still speak in terms of salvation and judgment. Because what else do you call a moment like this? This is more than vengeance, more than fairness. It's biblical. The mighty brought low, the low lifted up, if only for a night. There's a recorded moment from the German Peasants' War where a rebel leader, staring out over a burning noble estate, whispered, "Now heaven touches the earth." Not a speech, not a rallying cry, just awe. As if he, for the first time, believed the divine might actually see him, might hear him, because fire makes things visible, even to God. And here's your quirky fact. In some uprisings, peasants literally called themselves God's poor, or the heavenly army. They carried crude wooden crosses into battle. They painted halos on their tunics. They didn't just see themselves as angry, they saw themselves as righteous, chosen, their suffering transformed into purpose. Which is why, when the rebellion reaches its most fevered point, you don't feel like a victim anymore. You feel holy. Scholars still argue about whether this kind of religious fervour helped or hurt the movements. Did it inspire unity and resolve, or did it drift into delusion? One historian describes it as eschatological energy, a fancy way of saying people believe they were living through the end times. And when you believe the world's ending, you act like it. You take risks you wouldn't normally take. You swing harder. You scream louder. You push into the fire because you think it's a gate, not just a blaze. You believe, maybe foolishly, that something better waits on the other side, that once the dust settles and the screams die down, there will be a new order, a clean slate, a world where a man can grow food without having it stolen, where a woman's labour means something more than coin in another man's pocket. Of course, most of the time, that better world doesn't come. The soldiers return, the smoke clears. The new order looks suspiciously like the old one, only with fewer people to feed. But for that moment, this moment, it feels real. It feels inevitable. And that feeling, it's addictive. You can't bottle it, but you can pass it on like a fever, like a spark, and it keeps burning long after the last ember dies. You know you'll pay for this. The reckoning is coming. Maybe not tomorrow, maybe not next week, but it's coming. The Lord, if he survived, will come back with friends, or his son will, or some duke you've never met will decide your village needs a lesson. There will be gibbets, torture, fines so high you'll never crawl out of them. But tonight the world ended, and you were there to watch it collapse. You were there to laugh in the halls you once mopped, to stomp through the fields you were never paid for, to throw open the doors that have been locked your entire life. That matters. That happened. And even if tomorrow brings punishment and pain, even if you never raise a blade again, you'll carry this night like a hidden jewel. They can burn your home, they can break your body, but they'll never unmake the moment when, for just a flicker in time, heaven touched the earth, and it did so through you. Something has shifted in your chest. You didn't notice it at first. Not when you lit the torch or when you shouted yourself hoarse in the village square. Not even when the manor went up like a dry haystack and the sky turned that red-black colour that always means someone's going to write a ballad about this later. But now that you're walking back through the woods with ash on your clothes and blood on your boots, you feel it. Something inside you has changed. It's quiet, but it's loud in the way quiet things can be. The way a cracked dam doesn't roar but hums just before the water bursts through. For the first time in your life you tasted power. Not borrowed, not granted, not fake politeness from a steward who still spits after you walk past. Real power. The kind that comes from your own two hands and the willingness to risk everything. And once you've felt that, even once, there's no going back. You can fake submission, you can nod and scrape and call your new lord my grace, but deep down something in you has changed. You've cracked the mask of obedience, and it doesn't quite fit anymore. This is where it gets strange. You're still poor, still hungry, still in danger. The soldiers could be riding even now, your name written in shaky ink on a noble's arrest list. But you're different. You've stepped outside the role you were born into. You're not just peasant anymore. You're someone who stood up. And even if the world doesn't remember your name, you will. That internal shift, that's what historians call the psychological revolution. It's not about changing laws or kings. It's about changing people, how they see themselves, how they see the people around them. After a revolt, even a failed one, the ground doesn't just settle back into place. It stays cracked, unstable, like a field that's been overploughed. You can bury the dead. You can rebuild the manor, but you can't make people unsee what they saw. You saw a nobleman cry, you saw a priest run, you saw your neighbours, the same ones who never looked up from their boots, stand tall and shout like they were 10 feet high. And you saw yourself covered in soot and sweat holding a broken rake like it was a sword. And you weren't afraid. That kind of self-knowledge, that's dangerous. To the ruling class, that's lethal. Because revolts don't just threaten wealth, they threaten identity. The entire system depends on peasants believing they are peasants and nothing more. Farmers, tenants, tools with faces. Once that illusion breaks, it's impossible to patch up cleanly. So even if the soldiers kill the ringleaders and torch your fields, they haven't won. Not really, not completely, because the damage has already been done in you. There's a passage in a dusty 17th century record from a small Swiss canton, written by a monk who clearly disapproved of everything happening around him. He writes, "They returned to the plough, but not in spirit. They looked upon the earth with new eyes, as if it were owed to them." He meant it as a criticism, but honestly, it sounds like victory. You may go back to work, you may kneel again, but part of you will always remember the time when you didn't. There's a strange detail recorded after the Ciompi revolt in Florence. A wool worker, just a common man, went back to his job after the uprising was crushed and his guild was dissolved. But every Sunday, he'd walk past the government building, lift his hat and mutter, "We were there." No one stopped him, no one cared, but it was his ritual, his defiant whisper into the abyss. A reminder that for a short time the city belonged to people like him. This kind of psychological change is hard to track in history books. It doesn't come with dates or treaties or battles. It shows up in songs, in whispered prayers, in the way a woman looks a tax collector dead in the eye instead of lowering her head. It's in the way children remember stories their parents shouldn't have told them, the kind that start with, "When I was your age, we burned the ledger." Historians debate how lasting these changes really are. Some say they fade, that fear and hunger eventually grind everyone back into shape. Others argue that these revolts, even the failures, plant seeds, not for immediate reforms, but for the long game. Ideas buried like bulbs underground, waiting to bloom generations later when the sun hits just right. And they do bloom, slowly, quietly. But they do. You see it in laws that suddenly seem a little less cruel. In lords who build taller walls but tax just a bit less harshly. In religious sermons that sound a little more cautious, a little more humble. They'll never admit it. They'll say it's their own generosity, their own wisdom. But you'll know it was fear. Fear of what happens when peasants stop seeing themselves as peasants and start seeing themselves as people. That shift doesn't make you immortal, doesn't make you safe, but it makes you human. And for someone like you, raised to think of yourself as little more than hands and knees, that's revolutionary. You lie in your bed that night, what's left of it, staring up at a ceiling you can almost see through. Your arms ache, your back throbs, you're coughing smoke, but your eyes? Your eyes are open in a way they never were before. The rain starts just before dawn, soft at first, then heavier, soaking the ash and mixing with the mud in the road. It scrubs the walls clean of soot, smudges the charcoal graffiti on the village gate, and seeps into the scorched timbers of the manor that once towered over everything like a monument to your misery. You watch it all wash down the hill like spilled ink. The evidence, the chaos, the fury, rinsed away. You'd almost think the world was trying to pretend it never happened. But you remember, and so do they. You feel it in the silence, the way people avoid each other's eyes, the way the blacksmith hasn't opened his forge in days, even though you know he's inside, hammering anyway, just quieter now. You feel it when the children whisper instead of playing, and when the village priest locks the church door early, no longer interested in lingering by the steps to talk about harvests or grace. After the fire, after the rebellion, comes the waiting, the most suffocating part. No more chanting, no more torches, just long trembling days spent holding your breath, listening for hoofbeats, watching the horizon for that single speck of movement that means punishment is on the way. And make no mistake, it is coming. You don't know how soon, could be hours, could be weeks, but someone, somewhere is already writing the orders. Someone is deciding how many lashes equal a burnt manor. How many heads are needed to teach this corner of the map a lesson? Who's worth keeping? Who isn't? Because when the rebellion dies, justice doesn't arrive. Retribution does. There's always a reckoning after a peasant revolt. That's not just a fear, it's a rule. You've heard the stories, you've seen the gallows built before the soldiers even unpack their gear. You've seen the charred bodies left at crossroads, arms tied behind backs, mouths stuffed with dirt. The message is always the same. Don't try it again. Don't even fool about it. In England, after the 1381 revolt, entire villages were fined into oblivion. Land stripped, families broken apart. A few people were spared, sure, but only after grovelling so thoroughly that they barely recognised themselves. In France, during the Jacquerie, the retaliation was so swift and brutal that for months afterward, wolves were seen picking through fields littered with bones. And the most terrifying part? Most of it was legal, because the law has always been on their side. That's what really stings, doesn't it? Not the beating, not even the hangings, but the way it's all justified. Signed, sealed. The same court that never listened to your pleas for mercy suddenly becomes very interested when it's your neck in the noose. Disturbing the peace, they call it. As if there was ever any peace to begin with. Some of the worst punishments aren't physical, they're administrative. Entire communities stripped of their privileges, what little there were, collective taxes doubled, grain quotas raised, lords reimbursed for the damage, not by the king, but by you. And the ones who didn't participate? Doesn't matter. Guilt is contagious. It sticks to everyone in the village like soot on skin. You hear of one village, not far from yours, where the lord returned, rebuilt, and then demanded that every peasant who survived the uprising kneel in the square and kiss the hem of his robe. Every week, for a year. Not out of faith, not even out of loyalty, just to humiliate. And they did it, because what choice did they have? Here's a bizarre fact. After a failed revolt in 17th century Naples, a noble paid an artist to paint a massive fresco inside his villa, a scene of rebels being hanged, flayed and disemboweled right above the dining room. He'd host lavish dinners beneath it, offering wine to guests while bragging that this was how he handled disobedience. It's a little on the nose, but it proves the point. Retribution isn't just punishment. Tvångshind. It's performance. Some scholars argue that these brutal responses were designed less to restore order and more to stamp out hope. That after every rebellion, the most dangerous thing left behind wasn't the fire or the broken gates. It was the memory. The idea that things might have been different. That for a few days the world tilted. So the retribution has to be theatrical, over the top, sadistic. It has to not only crush the rebels, but shatter the story. If the revolt can be painted as barbarism, chaos, ungrateful madness, then the reaction, no matter how cruel, can be called righteousness. And if you're still alive after all this, you're supposed to feel lucky. That's the real mind trick. You survive, you go back to the fields, and you say thank you. Thank you for not killing my child. Thank you for only whipping me 10 times. Thank you for letting me rebuild my burned-out hovel on the same stolen land, gratitude soaked in grief. But here's the thing they don't account for. You may kneel, you may fall silent, but you remember. So does everyone else. And in that remembering, something quietly lives on, a stubborn ember, too small to see most days, but they're all the same. You feed it with stories, with songs, with glances shared across fields when a taxman rides by. You don't speak of rebellion, not out loud. But in your silence, in your careful smiles and bruised knuckles, the truth remains. You stood up once. They can kill a revolt. But they can't kill the knowledge that it happened. They can't unburn the manor. And no amount of rain can wash that clean. You wake to the sound of hammering. Not weapons, not the cold strike of sword on shield or the scream of metal on metal. Just wood against wood. Rhythmic, methodical. The carpenter is back at it, patching the roof of the alehouse that half burned when the steward's men tried to make a last stand. The tavern's chimney still leans awkwardly, like it's trying to remember which direction the smoke used to go. You lie there a moment on your straw mat, wondering if this is what rebuilding is supposed to feel like. Not triumph, not healing, but the dull ache of starting over. The village isn't dead. Not quite. It's limping, eyes sunken, ribs showing, but it's sin moving. One boot at a time. Someone has to fix the well. Someone has to herd the goats that scattered during the chaos. Someone has to replant the cabbages, even if the ground still smells faintly of smoke and blood. And someone has to sit by the road at night, sharpening a stick and watching the darkness. Because no one really believes it's over. Not in the way children believe bedtime ends with the sun. This isn't the kind of ending that lets you breathe. It's more like a pause, a bruise that's stopped swelling but hasn't started healing either. The rebellion is over, sure, but the wound it left? Still tender, still red around the edges, still aching when you breathe too deep. This is the strange middle space. Not peace, but not open revolt either. And it's in this liminal place that something shifts, quietly, slowly. Not just in the people, but in the systems. Because when revolts don't break the machine, they still rattle it. Maybe a local lord lowers taxes ever so slightly to avoid another uprising. Maybe a priest, haunted by the things he saw, starts preaching about justice instead of blind obedience. Maybe a village council begins to meet without noble permission, under the guise of market discussions. Small things, nothing that makes headlines, but they matter. In one part of 16th century France, after a particularly brutal revolt, records show that the local bishop issued an edict banning his own officials from taking more than 2 chickens per household as gifts. Seems minor, laughable even. But if you've ever watched your last 2 chickens marched off to some sweaty hand with a signet ring, you know it's not nothing. It means someone noticed. Someone got spooked. That's the beauty of a revolt that fails. It doesn't vanish. It lingers, in new rules, in quiet reforms, in this way a nobleman now travels with twice the guards and twice the charm, suddenly interested in hearing what the tenants think. He'll never say why, of course. Never mention the torchlight or the screams or the way his own steward's body washed up in the stream like driftwood. But he remembers, just like you. Historians refer to this as post-revolt adaptation. It's less exciting than battles, but maybe more important, the slow, grudging shift in how power behaves after it's been scared half to death. Not because it wants to be better, but because it doesn't want another surprise visit at midnight. And your role in all this, you become something else, not just a farmer, not just a wife or cobbler or cooper. You become a witness, a carrier of memory, the one who was there. Maybe you don't tell your children everything. Maybe you edit a few details, polish some of the messier moments, but you pass it on. Not just the facts, the feeling, the possibility. Here's a quirky twist for you. In some parts of Eastern Europe, village elders would designate one person, the memory keeper, to recite the story of the last uprising at feast days. Not as celebration, as a warning, a lesson, a ritual. The position wasn't formal, but it was sacred. It said, we remember the fear, the fire, the moment the wall cracked, and we carry that story like a torch we're not ready to pass just yet, and that's what the ruling class fears most. Not the riot itself, but the retelling. Because retelling breeds questions. Questions breed doubt. Doubt becomes friction. Friction becomes fire. You see it when the new steward comes through town. He's younger than the last one. Boots too clean, hands too soft. He offers blessings, smiles wide, says he wants to rebuild trust. You nod. Everyone nods. But no one really buys it. You serve him food. You bow when he passes. But there's a tightness in your jaw that wasn't there before. You're not fooled. You're aware. And that alone changes everything. The land may not be yours. The rules may not be fair. The taxes may still break your back. But the curtain's been pulled back. The illusion of divine hierarchy, of noble supremacy, of fixed fate is been scorched, even if only a little. And even that little scar on your hands, your heart, your village, it won't fade. The carpenter hammers, the well groans, and you tighten your belt, spit into your palms and go back to work. Not because you've given up, but because you're not finished. Not yet. You sit on the edge of the fields again, hands caked in soil, the smell of manure and crushed grass rising in waves around you. The wind brushes through the grain, still short, not yet ripe. It's the same place you sat a year ago, maybe two, before the revolt, before the shouting, before the fire. It looks the same, but you're not the same at all. Because even if you've returned to the rows and rhythms of labour, there's a pulse beneath your skin now, a slow, deep thrum that wasn't there before. It hums through your bones like the memory of a song you don't sing out loud. The kind of song that only comes from knowing what it feels like to rise. You're supposed to forget. That's what everyone's counting on. The lords, the stewards, the friars. They're all hoping your mind will dull again, that the fire of rebellion will fade like bruises on old skin. That you'll get used to the weight again, the taxes, the curtsies, the hunger. But they don't understand how memory works. Especially not this kind of memory. You don't forget what it feels like to demand something and not ask permission. You don't forget what it's like to shout until your voice goes hoarse, surrounded by others who sound just like you. You don't forget the smell of justice burning. Because when every other avenue is blocked, when your pleas are laughed at, your petitions ignored, your lives taxed and trampled and wrung dry, violence starts to feel like the only language anyone listens to. It's not that peasants love it. You didn't revolt because you wanted to burn things down. You revolted because it was the only way left to be heard. You exhausted everything else first. You begged. You bargained. You bent over backwards so far you could kiss the soles of your master's boots. And still they asked for more. So yes, eventually you lit the torch. And no matter what anyone says now, how they spin the story, how they call you savage or irrational or lawless, you know why you did it. Because when all the other roads are closed, rage becomes a compass, a map, a tool for clearing space where there was none, a howl you carry deep in your belly, the one they tried to beat out of you but couldn't. There's a pattern to these things, always has been. You ask nicely, you're ignored. You ask again, you're mocked. You demand, you're punished. Then, when the fire finally comes, the same people who created the pressure cry foul. Why so violent, they ask, standing in the ruins of the very system that pushed you past your limit. It's like watching someone block the only exit, then blame you for breaking a window to breathe. You're not a fool. You know violence has a cost. You've seen the cost. It wears a hood, it swings a sword, it starves your children in the name of order. But peaceful options, they were never really offered. Not to people like you. And if you must choose between a slow death and a loud one, you'll take the loud one, every time. A curious bit of irony. Nobles often record peasant violence in painstaking detail. Every broken window, every stolen chicken, every overturned barrel is written down like scripture. But the daily violence they impose, the poverty, the hunger, the forced labour, that part gets left out. It's not called violence when it comes with a seal and a signature. It's called duty, tradition, God's will. So when peasants finally snap, it shocks no one who's paying attention. It only shocks the people who benefit from pretending not to see. And let's be clear, your revolt wasn't just a tantrum. It was strategic, targeted. When you burned the manor, you burned the records of your debts. When you stormed the grain cellar, you fed your starving neighbours. When you hung the steward, you removed the man who whipped children for sport. That wasn't senseless chaos. That was correction. And even when the powers write their side of the story, when they say you were drunk, crazed, manipulated by foreign agents or devilish heresies, you still hold the truth. You didn't revolt because you were misled. You revolted because you finally saw the bars of your cage clearly enough to reach through them. Some scholars today try to argue over whether peasant violence was rational, as if starving people need to justify why they're angry, as if the moral weight of revolt is heavier than the crushing burden that triggered it. Others claim you acted out of desperation, not politics. But that's a neat little trick, isn't it? Pretend that survival and politics are separate, as if fighting for bread, for rest, for dignity isn't political. There's a story, probably apocryphal, but it lives for a reason, of an old woman who after a failed revolt stood in front of a tribunal and said, if they had listened when we whispered, they would not have bled when we screamed. No title, no army, just a line carved out of pain and truth. You imagine her voice when you pluck weeds now. You imagine her face when you look at the land and wonder once again if it will ever truly be yours. You reach out down into the soil. It's damp from last night's rain. It clings to your fingers, feeds the roots, smells like rot and life and potential. This land has seen blood, but it's also seen rebellion. And somewhere deep under your calluses, and the silence you've wrapped around your memories, you still carry both. The road stretches ahead, uneven and rutted, with patches of grass creeping through the cracks like stubborn survivors. You walk slowly, stick in hand, pack on your back, not because you have anywhere to be, but because you can't stay. Not here, not after everything. The village is still standing, more or less. The fields are green again. The Lord's new steward keeps his distance. People smile more now, even if it's a little tight around the eyes. But for you, something keeps nudging you forward, out. You're looking for something. Not land, not coin, maybe not even safety. You're looking for what comes next. It happens sometimes. After the uprising burns out and the ashes cool, some people don't go back to their old lives. They become wanderers, messengers, watchers on the road. Not outcasts exactly, though that's what some call them. More like witnesses. People who carry the memory of revolt like a pilgrim carries a relic. They walk from town to town offering help, sharing stories, keeping their ember warm beneath their ribs. And whether they mean to or not, they become sparks. You visit a village that's heard of what happened in yours. Not the full story, but enough. The fire, the shout, the night of knives and justice. A woman leans in close as you mend a fence and whispers, "Did it work?" Her eyes are hungry. Not for bread, for hope. And you don't know how to answer her. Not really. You could tell her the manor burned, that the steward ran, that taxes dropped for a while. But you could also tell her about the reprisals, the gallows, the silence afterward. Both stories are true, both are incomplete. So instead you say, "We stood up," and she nods like she understands exactly what you mean. The road takes you farther. Through forests, past river towns, over high, wind-bitten passes where people say rebellions can't happen because no one has anything left to burn. But even there you see signs. A black mark on a chapel door. A child who sings a song that sounds suspiciously like one of the chants from your village, reshaped into rhyme and passed off as play. A drunk who raises a cup to the poor who bit back. This is how revolt survives, not just in memory but in mutation. It adapts. It becomes part of the folk language, woven into lullabies, proverbs, even jokes. Someone tells a tale of a tax collector who slipped on a pig's bladder and broke his nose, and everyone laughs just a little too hard. Not because it's true, because it could be. Scholars will later try to write these uprisings into neat little timelines. Begin date, end date, outcome. They'll argue over which ones mattered and which ones fizzled, but you know better. You were there, you felt it. Rebellion isn't a single event, it's a feeling. A wave that rises and crashes but never completely disappears. It hides underground, in silence and shame and story, until something cracks, and then it rushes back up like a flood. In Bohemia, they still speak of the bonfire sermons, where peasants gathered in the woods with stolen pages of scripture and a rusty sword stuck into a stump like a holy totem. In Spain, old women tie red threads around their wrists to honour a revolt from generations ago. The blood thread, they call it, a sign that someone in their family stood up. No one even remembers exactly which revolt anymore. It doesn't matter. Revolts leave marks, not just in scorched buildings or battlefields, but in the imagination. The very idea that the world could be different, that people like you, like all of us, can change it, sticks around, even when the rebellion fails. And that's why they're always so afraid. The lords, the bishops, the kings, not just of the pitchforks or the fire. They're afraid of the echo of one village that dared to fight, bouncing through time like a drumbeat no army can silence. That's what keeps them up at night. Not your strength, your memory. You stop in a new town just as evening falls, the square is quiet, people look tired. You see the same eyes you've seen everywhere, worn, wary, watching. A boy is sweeping the steps of the tax office, and for a moment you wonder what would happen if you walked up, knocked on the door, and said the words you once shouted in your own village. Would anyone join you? Would they even know what you meant? Maybe not tonight. But one day, you sit on a bench and take out your bread, the crust hard but edible. A girl sits next to you. She doesn't speak. She just stares at your walking stick wrapped in old cloth where a blade used to be lashed. You feel her eyes on it, on your hands, your scars, your silence. She says, "Did you really fight?" And you nod. She grins, a gap-toothed, crooked thing. Then she says, "I want to too." You look at her and smile, soft and tired and real. Then one day, you tell her, you will. Because she will, they all will. Because as long as there are boots on necks, there will be fists in the air. As long as power demands silence, someone will scream. And as long as there are people who remember, the story continues. You chew your bread, the wind picks up, and the road, forever unfinished, calls you on. So here you are, lying back now. Probably a little heavier in the chest than you were 30 sections ago. That's fair. We've been through some things together. Uprisings and beatings, betrayals and barn burnings, nights with torches and days with nothing but dried out bread crusts and a growing sense that nobody up top was ever going to help. You've walked barefoot through mud thick with ash. You've heard children cry for food that didn't exist, and still, you got back up. You fought, you burned what needed burning, and you remembered. That's the part they never quite count on, isn't it? That you remember. Because revolts, especially the kind poor people wage, aren't just about the battles. They're about the after. The quiet, the rebuilding, the stories, the weight in your hands when you hold your kid and wonder what kind of world you've passed to them, and whether the price you paid will bloom into something better, or whether they'll have to pay it all over again. And maybe they will. Maybe they'll carry a pitchfork too someday, or maybe they'll carry books instead. Maybe they'll sit in council halls with stronger voices and fewer broken backs. Maybe they'll remember how you stood up when no one else would, and how, even when it all came crashing down, your spine stayed straight, even if it was only for a night. Because here's the truth, no gallows or gatehouse can scrub clean. Rebellion isn't a moment. It's a memory passed hand to hand, whisper to whisper, fire to ember, to spark. And tonight, you've carried that spark a little further. You've seen why the revolts were so violent. Not because the peasants loved chaos, but because sometimes survival requires it. Because when justice is denied long enough, fury becomes its own kind of truth. So wherever you are right now, under a warm blanket maybe, or curled up next to someone you love, just know that rage in the dark, that wasn't just destruction. It was creation. A howl, yes, but also a hymn. And if you hear hoofbeats in the distance, don't panic and just check the oil, keep the pitchfork nearby, and keep the story alive.